All right, hello everyone. Good morning. My name's Chris Haney. I'm the Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Center. Good morning and thank you for being here. Everybody should smile. We're about to talk about the budget. I feel like I'm the dentist up here or something, right? Thank you for all for joining us today for our budget preview for the 2018-19 California state budget. We've got a lot of people signed up. We're going to have a couple hundred people here in this room over the course of this morning, and we've got another 300 plus people who are joining us online via a live webinar. So thanks for all of you who are here in person, and thanks to everybody who's joining us online. I also want to thank the California Endowment for making this beautiful space available for us to host this event. They've been longtime supporters of our organization. We couldn't do our work without them, and we greatly appreciate them making this kind of space available for these kind of events. This event is part of a series we do throughout the course of the year called the Policy Perspectives Speaker Series. It's a series of events, both in person and online, here in Sacramento, around the state, a series of webinars where we address some of the key challenges and opportunities that are facing our state, the debates that are underway, and identify the right kinds of policy choices that we hope will advance better outcomes for low and middle income Californians. If you like this kind of work, it's that time of year when nonprofits across the world are asking people to consider contributing to their organizations, and we're no different. We couldn't do this work without the support of foundations and the individuals who provide us with support. So, think of us as that stocking stuffer for that family member who just can't get enough budget analysis. If that's the case, we're the sort of gift that keeps on giving the whole year through. So got that. We'd appreciate any support, of course. So very quick overview of the agenda. I'm going to get off the stage here in just a minute. And what we're going to do is provide a presentation on how the state budget process works, sort of the basic information that anybody needs in order to access the state's debate and to advocate for the kinds of policy change that you or your organizations want to see. Then when that piece is done, we'll take a quick break. We've got a reset up here on the stage, and we're going to move to a moderated session where I'll be joined by several folks who are longtime experts on state budget advocacy, and we'll be talking about what we see coming in the next year's budget. We like these events to be as much of a dialogue as possible, so we're leaving plenty of time for Q&A. For those of you here in the room, we will have staff who will run a mic over to you when you raise your hand if you have a question. So please wait for the mic so that that question can be heard by the folks online and be a part of the taping. For those of you who are online, there's a couple of ways that you can raise your questions. You can, in the GoToWebinar interface on the dashboard, you can type in some questions, or you can pose your question to us via Twitter, and our team here will be feeding those to the presenters. And speaking of Twitter, we encourage you to share your comments and key takeaways in real time during the event. The hashtag is #PolicyPerspectives. We're providing relevant Twitter handles on your agenda handout that you have, and we certainly welcome any activity on that front. And lastly, there's a question that comes up at all these kind of events. Of course, all of the PowerPoints and materials will be made available by tomorrow morning and sent out to all of you so that you can have those for future reference. And for those of you here in the room, we'll of course have some print materials that you can take with you. So that's it for me. I'm going to get off the stage here shortly, but it's my pleasure to move us on and to introduce Scott Graves, our Director of Research. Scott's been with the Budget Center since 2002 and has worked on a whole host of issues related to the state budget: child care, housing, safety net, health care, criminal justice reform, and those are just a few. He also takes the lead in developing and updating a series of training seminars that we provide, like the one you're about to see on the state budget, and we introduced a county budget process tool very similarly this last year that we've been sharing around the state. And so Scott takes the lead on those. So you have one of the leading experts in the state on how the state budget process works and how you can access available to you today. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and we'll ask Scott some questions about how these things work. Thank you once again for being here. Scott?
Good morning, everyone. We have to make a brief transition here. I'm going to test my skills and my memory. I did it. So good morning, everyone. I've got you trapped here for an hour to talk about the budget process this morning. I will not be talking the entire hour if I've timed things correctly. I want to leave time for a Q&A at the end. What I want to do this morning is provide you all in the room and everyone online with sort of a high-level overview of how the state budget process works based on our guide, which we have updated and released today. Everyone in the room will receive one of these at the break, and we will be emailing this out tomorrow to our full list, including those of you who are watching online. We also have a one-page guide to the state budget process in infographic form, which some of you may have already seen. We have printed these out, and these will also be distributed at the break. So I guess that's one way of saying there's really no need to take notes right now to the extent that you thought you were going to be seriously taking notes. Probably not necessary because you're going to get some resources at the end of the presentation. So this is more of a budget process 101, sort of a high-level introduction. I'm not going to be handing out the budget bill and asking you to turn to page 743 and look at an item of appropriation. That's not the kind of training we're doing here. That's sort of a 201. We're going to be looking at the budget in terms of high-level information about the process and trying to set the context for the budget, because I think that also helps us to understand how and why certain decisions are being made throughout the year. So my goal really for everyone in the room, including seasoned budget watchers and those online as well, is for everyone to learn at least one new thing. So I'm not going to quiz you at the end and ask you if you learned anything new. So my hope is that by presenting a wide array of information this morning, hopefully you'll be able to take away something from this presentation about the state budget process that hadn't occurred to you before, and hopefully will be helpful to you in your own work going into 2018 as you try to advocate for the kinds of issues you care about through the state budget process. So in terms of like what's going on this morning with the handouts and such, as I've already explained, we have the guide and the infographic, which will be distributed to those in the room. Those online, you'll be able to access that tomorrow. We'll send out an email. We'll also send out an email with my presentation slide deck, which is different from the other two things we're going to be handing out today. And for Q&A purposes, it would be great if we could leave sort of question and answer of a longer kind of format toward the end of my presentation. But if you have clarifying questions, those of you in the room, please raise your hand and a mic will magically appear before you so you can ask that brief clarifying question. For those online, you can either tweet at us at #PolicyPerspectives with a question, or you can enter a question in the question pane of the GoToWebinar dashboard. So lots of ways to ask us questions this morning. So before we get into the substance of the presentation, I have a kind of a rhetorical question for you all, and it has to do with what comes to mind when you think about California's state budget. So do you think of it as a perplexing jumble of numbers? What does this all mean? Do you think of it as politics, partisanship, horse trading, deal making, all happening under a beautiful white dome just a few blocks from where we're sitting today? Do you think of it as what in the world is going on? A series of questions, unable to sort of piece together what is happening in any given year. Well, if I'm honest with you, I will tell you that I have all of these thoughts every year as I move through every budget process, and I've been working on these issues and thinking about the budget process for over 15 years now. So these are all very normal ways of reacting to the state budget and the process as it unfolds each year. But I would also urge everyone in the room, when we think about the state budget and the process, to really think about this. It's about the real face of Californians, people who are affected, impacted by the decisions that are made right here in Sacramento. You know, questions like the state budget determines things like, will youngsters have access to a safe place to play and learn while their parents are at work? right? Do young adults have access to a high-quality, affordable college education? Do seniors and people with disabilities, are they able to access the care and support that they need and deserve? Those are the kinds of questions that get answered every year through our state budget process, because the state budget is much more than about numbers, right? Dollars, cents. It's really about our values. Every year, the state budget gives us an opportunity, and the process we use to enact it gives us an opportunity to think about our values and priorities as Californians and try to enact them into law. So it's another way of sort of asking a question, what kind of California do we want to live in? So every year we get an opportunity to answer that question. It doesn't mean that the answers always come the way we would hope that they would, that the decisions that are made line up exactly with our particular values and priorities. But every year the budget gives us an opportunity to engage in a way that we can advance our own values and priorities through that process. So the process isn't just about getting numbers into a budget, it's about making improvements to public policies in a way that will have a real and lasting impact on Californians. So really important to set that out at the outset. That's why we're here today. Understanding the process will help us to engage better in the budget debates that occur each year. So my goals for the presentation, moving more into the substance here, what do I want to do over the next half hour or so? I want to first set out some key facts about the state budget so that we're all on the same page. I want to talk about the constitutional framework for the state budget process. I want to review the budget process timeline, including both the governor's role and the legislature's role. And I also want to talk throughout about how members of the public can get involved in this process, not just in 2018, but in the years ahead. So let's start first with some key facts about the state budget. The first thing that's important to understand is that the state budget really consists of state funds and federal funds. So for the budget that was enacted, which Governor Brown signed into law a few months ago for the current fiscal year, 2017-18, which took effect on July 1st, that is a $290 billion budget. That's billion with a B. California is close to having a $300 billion state budget. It could happen in the upcoming fiscal year. Of that $290 billion, more than 7 in 10 of those dollars, about 2/3 of those dollars come from state funds. The two biggest sources of state funds in the budget come from the general fund or special fund. So the general fund, not a very excitingly named fund, that's about $125 billion in the current fiscal year. What is that paying for? It's paying for higher education costs, it's paying for K-12 education, for child care, correctional officers in state prisons. It's kind of, you can think of it as like the checking account for the state. The dollars that go into the general fund can be used for any purpose allowed by law. There are no strings attached to those dollars. And when we hear about the budget doing well, or we're in a budget deficit situation, this is the part of the budget we're talking about, the state's general fund. The other major source of state dollars in the state budget come from what are called special funds. California has hundreds of special funds, and in the current year, we expect to spend about $55 billion from these special funds. So these are funds that account for taxes, fees, licenses, that sort of all have strings attached. So if the dollars go into a fund, they must be spent for a particular purpose. So a dollar that goes into the state parks fund must be spent on state parks. Can't be used to pay for Medi-Cal or CalWORks or higher education at the CSU or the University of California. So those are the funds that have the strings attached. But most of the time, as I said earlier, when we're thinking about the state budget and state funds, we're thinking largely about the general fund because that's where most of the opportunities are to expand programs and services through those general fund dollars. Then just want to shift to the federal part here. A lot of people are kind of surprised to hear that, oh, we have a lot of federal money in our state budget. It's a state budget, but it has federal dollars. Yes, it does. We expect to spend over $100 billion in federal funds that flow through our state budget this year. Anybody have an idea where most of those federal dollars might be going? Healthcare people. Medi-Cal, we'll talk a little bit about that later, but these dollars are supporting a broad range of services, but for the most part, Health and Human Services is getting the vast majority of federal dollars. So, as I mentioned, there are a broad range of services and systems that are supported through our state budget. If we look just at state dollars first, right? Remember I mentioned the general fund and the special fund dollars together in the current year, that's $180 billion. How is that $180 billion split up? This chart is showing that more than 7 in 10 of those state dollars are going to a couple of purposes. Either Health and Human Services, right, Medi-Cal, CalWORKS, Child Welfare Services, in-home supportive services, all that, plus K-12 education and higher education. Just those three parts of the state budget account for more than 70% of total spending from state funds in the current fiscal year. Now, we fund other things with these state funds, right? Corrections, transportation, natural resources, but those tend to be much smaller proportions. Most of the state dollars spent through the budget are going for those three purposes: higher education, K-12 education, and Health and Human Services. Now, if we look at the federal dollars and how they are allocated through our state budget, much different and no contest in terms of where they're going. About 3/4 of federal dollars spent through our state budget are supporting Health and Human Services programs. And as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of those dollars are going to our Medi-Cal program, which provides healthcare services for around 14 million low-income Californians. So most of the federal money coming into California is going to support our Medi-Cal program with some other Health and Human Services as well, gaining federal support. So that's kind of the big picture on sort of how the dollars are allocated. One other fact that I wanted to mention about our state budget is that it's actually a budget package. Some people, when they think of the budget, they think, oh, there's just one bill and it's called the budget. Actually, the budget is made up every year of multiple bills, not a single bill. So one way to think about it in terms of the types of bills is we have two kinds. First, we have this thing called the budget bill. So a couple things to keep in mind about the budget bill. The first is that it provides thousands of appropriations across a broad range of public services and systems for a single fiscal year. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, this is the Department of Finance, works for the governor. They put together the budget bills, the Budget Act for the current fiscal year, and it's over 750 pages long, containing thousands upon thousands of individual appropriations for agencies, departments, boards, commissions, the UC, the CSU, all of it. Anything funded through the state budget is appearing here. This is the summary of what has happened to date. The second thing to keep in mind about the budget bill is that it moves through a distinct process, right? It moves through budget committees. Many of you may be more familiar with the legislature's policy bill process, where we have policy committees and appropriations committees that consider the fiscal impact of a bill. The budget bill does not go through those committees. It goes through an entirely separate process on its own timeline, going through budget committees and subcommittees. Has nothing to do with the policy bill side. And the third thing to keep in mind about the budget bill, as I've indicated here on this slide, is that there can be multiple budget bills, and that's kind of a head scratcher because a lot of us are used to thinking of the budget bill. Actually, in recent years, we have seen 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 budget bills within a couple of months, and there could be more. There's actually no limit. So we'll get to that a little bit more in a second. In addition to budget bills, the rest of the budget package is made up of trailer bills. So trailer bills, you can think of those as sort of the instructions on how to implement the policy changes assumed in the budget bill, right? So the budget bill is largely just a bunch of numbers. $100 billion for X. What's it supposed to be spent on? Is it more or less than the previous year? If it's less, how are we generating those savings? You spell that out in state law, and law changes are made through the trailer bills, not through the budget bills. So that's one key thing that the trailer bills are doing. They are changing state law to reflect the policies assumed in the state budget bill. Trailer bills also are moving, generally speaking, through the same process as the budget bill, right? Moving through the budget committees and subcommittees, which we'll be talking about. Not necessarily the policy bill side of the process, but there are occasions when trailer bills, for various reasons, can move through the policy bill side of the process and still be considered part of the overall budget package. And at Q&A, if anyone is interested in that, we can talk a little bit about it. And finally, the budget package, in terms of trailer bills, can have any number of trailer bills. It's not like there's a limit in the Constitution that says you can only have 10. In some years, we've had dozens of trailer bills. So trailer bills can kind of proliferate and are used depending on the fiscal situation for the state, the types of changes that are being made. So let's just look briefly at what the budget package looks like for the current fiscal year, 2017-18. So we have the original budget bill, Assembly Bill 97, signed by Governor Brown in June, okay, over 750 pages long. Then we ended up with a few more budget bills after the passage of the original budget bill, right? So these are sort of amending the original budget bill by adding appropriations for the most part to the 17-18 budget bill. We also had a budget bill that addressed the budget for the prior fiscal year, 16-17. So often you will see the legislature coming back almost at the end of a fiscal year and saying, we need to change or add appropriations, and we're going to do it through another budget bill, not related to the year coming up, but related to the year that is about to end. And then we have 27 trailer bills as part of this year's budget package. We had many in the Senate, and we had quite a few in the Assembly as well. Each of these trailer bills is addressing a different area: K-12 education, healthcare services, higher education, kind of running the gamut. This is sort of where the rubber meets the road. So when you think of the budget, the most important thing I'd say to be keeping in mind is that we're not talking about a single bill here. We are talking about multiple bills, and you'll never know at the start of the year how many budget bills, how many trailer bills there will be. It's something that you'll need to follow through the process to make sure you know where the issues that you care about are being addressed. Okay, so now turning to the constitutional framework for the state budget process. This is where the rubber meets the road in terms of the rules. Most of the rules for the state's budget process are set out in our state's constitution. I wanted to highlight this document here, which some of you may have seen. You can buy this in the bill room in the basement of the state capitol. They update it every couple of years because it keeps changing. Our Constitution is not static. It's always being revised, so it's always a good idea, if you like things in hard copy like this, to buy one. Of course, you can also access the state Constitution online. So there's no need to buy the document, but this is one way of sort of keeping up to date in terms of what these rules are. Our state Constitution is incredibly long and complex, particularly compared to our national Constitution. So if you look at the U.S. Constitution, it's about 7,800 words long, and it's been amended 27 times over a couple of centuries. Our state Constitution has about 75,000 words and has been amended hundreds of times. So this is sort of an indication that California has sort of a living constitution. It's not static in any way. Every couple of years, measures appear before the voters on the statewide ballot in which we are asked to make changes, revisions, additions to our state constitution. And not always, but often we say yes. And as a result, our state constitution changes quite frequently. And in fact, if we just go back to the period of the late 1970s after the adoption of Proposition 13 in 1978, there have been about a dozen ballot measures that have had a pretty significant impact on the state budget and the budget process. I'm not going to run through all of these here. I just wanted you to have a sense of kind of starting in the upper left-hand corner and working your way clockwise. You know, when you move from Prop 13 in 1978, we've got a few ballot measures in the interim. A lot of them have occurred since 2010, and I'm going to be speaking about some of those. But it's another way of indicating that the voters, we the people, are often asked to weigh in on what our Constitution should look like and what the basic rules of governing our state should be. And I have no doubt that we'll be asked to weigh in again. In November of 2018, there are likely to be at least a couple or a few ballot measures that will ask us to amend our state constitution. But this is where the basic rules of the game are. So it's important, even though the document may seem like it's a little challenging to get through, there are key pieces of information in our state constitution that are really critical for advocates to understand in terms of engaging with the state budget process. So one of the key rules set out in the state constitution has to do with deadlines. There are only two deadlines related to the state budget. The first is that the governor is required to produce a balanced budget for the upcoming fiscal year on or before January 10th. That's 4 weeks from today, I believe. So we're just, you know, a little less than a month out from Governor Brown releasing his final budget that he will see through the process as governor of California. June 15th is another date that's laid out in the state constitution. That's the date by which the legislature has to pass the budget bill, right? The first budget bill, probably. Just has to pass the bill and send it to the governor. The bill doesn't ultimately need to be signed. The governor could veto it. They could go back to the drawing board. As long as the legislature has, by midnight, passed a budget bill, they have met their obligation under the state constitution. If they miss that deadline, they forfeit their pay and reimbursement for travel and living expenses for every day that the budget is late and not sent to the governor. This rule went into effect in 2011. They have met the deadline every year since then. So essentially you had about 7 on-time budgets. So it's amazing. That's not the only reason, of course, why we would see on-time budgets, but it's an incredible motivating factor when you hear that if you miss a deadline, you might lose some of your pay. You know, it's not the only reason, but it probably, you know, plays at least a small role. Because voters last year passed Proposition 54 on the statewide ballot, we now have a requirement that bills be in print 72 hours before they're voted on. There has been a disagreement, a difference of opinion between the Assembly and the Senate over how exactly to interpret that, which I'm not going to get into here. But for the most part, it does apply to the budget bill and to all trailer bills. So what this really means is if you have a 72-hour bill in print requirement for the budget bill now, which we do, that means if the budget must be passed by June 15th, the budget bill must be finalized for that purpose by June 12th. So we've essentially backed up the date by which the budget must be passed, at least the initial version of the budget, not necessarily the final version of the budget, to June 12th. So it's sort of shortened that window of opportunity for advocates to engage the budget process during that relatively fast-moving time of year when the deal-making is going on between legislative leaders and the governor. We have a majority vote budget, right? Since 2010 and the passage of Proposition 25, the legislature has been able to pass the budget by a majority vote of each house. Now that was a sea change. Some of you, if you were around before that, you know that the budget was frequently late because we had a 2/3 vote requirement. So although the Democrats during this period of the last, for most of the last few decades have had majorities, it's been rare that they have had supermajorities, so they've always had to before Prop 25, they always had to find a way to bring a couple, at least, Republicans on board to support the budget, which made it difficult to close a deal on time. That's why we frequently saw late budgets. And in fact, in 2010, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger finally signed the budget package in October, 4 months into the fiscal year. That was about 7 years ago. That was right before Prop 25 went on the ballot, and the voters said, yes, this makes sense. Let's let the legislature go ahead. The majority party in the legislature can have full control over expenditures. They can pass it without any support from the minority party, and that's what we have today. At the same time, on the same ballot, voters also were asked, do you want to tighten up the requirement for tax increases? Do you want to make it even more difficult for the legislature to increase revenues during any given year? And what did the voters say? Yes, that sounds like a very good idea. So what the voters did is they took the state's existing 2/3 vote requirement for taxes, which had originally been put in place by Proposition 13 in 1978, and they really souped it up. They said, essentially, we're going to require a larger number of tax increases, sort of expand it to different kinds of revenue increases that weren't necessarily covered by Proposition 13's rule. And they did this as follows. They added this language to the state constitution. Any change in state statute which results in any taxpayer paying a higher tax requires a 2/3 vote of each house of the legislature. So, for example, if I point to my colleague Amy in the front row here, if we decided that it was a good idea to raise Amy's taxes and give all the rest of us a tax cut, that would still require a 2/3 vote because one person would be paying a higher tax even though all of the rest of us would be getting a tax cut. Now, that's kind of a silly example, right? But it sort of goes, it gives you an indication of the length to which Proposition 26 goes. Whereas before, under Prop 13's rules, there were some ways in which the legislature could raise fees or raise some taxes while reducing others, as long as it nets out to zero, which could be good tax policy. Now, under Prop 26, any tax that goes up under any circumstances triggers a 2/3 vote requirement. So we have a situation in which the legislature's majority party has complete control over the spending side of the budget, and unless they have solid 2/3 majorities in each house, they have no control over the revenue side of the budget. This is the situation we have currently. It's also important to keep in mind that the state budget is not a blank slate. Legislators and the governor aren't starting from scratch every year when they consider the state budget and what it might look like in the coming year. Part of the reason for that is that we have an incremental budgeting process in California. We don't blow up the budget every year and make agencies justify all of their expenditures and start from zero, right? We're sort of saying, what did you get last year? Do you need more next year? Why? How much should it be? We're sort of arguing over how to raise the baseline versus everyone goes down to zero and justifies it. So that's one reason. But another reason is that our Constitution contains formulas that set priorities for how dollars should be allocated for certain parts of the budget during the fiscal year. So I'm not going to go into detail on these, but I just want to give you 3 major examples. So the first is Proposition 98, which voters approved in 1988. This is the one I assume everyone has probably heard of and is somewhat familiar with. It's one of these very complicated constitutional formulas that sort of lays out a process for determining how much of the state's budget should go toward K-12 schools and community colleges each year. So it sets what's called a minimum funding guarantee by formula. That's in the Constitution. We also have Proposition 2, which the voters approved back in 2014. That sets a requirement for the governor and legislators to put aside a certain amount of the state's general fund revenues each year into a budget reserve that's very hard to unlock and get into and use, as well as to pay down certain state debt. So that is now in the Constitution. Certain dollars are automatically taken off the table that might have been used to fund a program or a service. Now those are going into a reserve used to pay down debt. On the plus side, setting aside money for when the next downturn comes. Maybe that will allow California to limit the reductions across programs, because then we can reach into that reserve, pull the dollars out, and use them to make up for the lost revenues as a result of a recession. But it means in the meantime, we're not able to access those dollars to spend to expand programs in the current year. And finally, just last year, we passed Proposition 55, and one thing that did is created a new formula that will increase funding for Medi-Cal, our state health care program for low-income residents, under certain fiscal conditions. So this coming year is the first year in which that requirement could be triggered. It's not clear that it will be triggered, but when the governor releases his budget, we'll have a better sense of that. So those are some examples of how our Constitution sort of lays out priorities for how dollars should be spent, that takes the sort of the responsibility out of the hands of our policymakers and sets them up as automatic formulas that requires dollars to be spent in a certain way. Okay, so let's move to the key players and the timeline of the state budget process. The most important thing that I think we should be thinking about when we think about the budget process, and hopefully maybe this will be a new bit of information for people, or maybe you already realize this, but the budget process is actually cyclical. It's sort of an endless loop. Imagine, a bicycle wheel sort of going round and round and round and round. There is no logical start date. There is no logical stop date, right? Decisions about the state budget are being made in public and behind the scenes, largely in Sacramento, throughout the year. There's never a time when you can say, oh, it's the off season for the budget. I don't have to pay attention anymore. I'm going to wake up in January, and I'm going to go to sleep at the end of May, and I don't have to worry about the budget anymore. In fact, someone around California, most likely in Sacramento, is always thinking about the state budget, last year's budget, this year's budget, the budget for the coming fiscal year. So that means there are always opportunities for members of the public to engage with that process. Doesn't mean you're always successful, but it means that the opportunities are available. This is our effort to sort of summarize on one slide, one infographic, the state budget process. I'm not going to ask you to read this now. I'm not going to talk from it because I understand the font is very small. I just wanted to remind you that those in the room will be receiving this as a hard copy. It's also available on our website, and we'll email out a reminder about it tomorrow. But our infographic sort of puts on one page key dates, key players, and some notable opportunities for the public to engage in the process throughout the year. And by using, sort of illustrating it as a wheel or a circle, hopefully reinforce the point that it's not linear. There's not like start here, end there, and you're done. Always going around, and if we really did it in a complicated way, it would look like three-dimensional chess, because you have to overlay multiple things on top of this. This is our simplest way of getting at what's going on here. So if we think about the key players in the budget process, they are, right? Probably no big surprise here. Governor Brown, right? Probably the single most powerful person in the budget process. We also have the legislature plays a key role. Here we have the Senate's leader, Kevin De Leon, and Anthony Rendon, the Speaker of the State Assembly. And then, of course, we have the public. I couldn't put up any individual face there, so it's kind of a mass of people at hopefully a peaceful rally. But just to give an indication that the public does have a role in this process here. It's not a process in which it's simply the governor and the legislature getting together and figuring things out on their own. There are lots of opportunities for the public to be engaged and actually welcomed, okay? So you may feel sometimes that your input is not welcome, but often, for the most part, it is welcomed. So let's talk about a little bit about the governor's role here. The governor has, as I said, a pretty powerful role in the state budget process. We have an executive-centered budget process in California. Now, this afternoon, Assemblymember Phil Ting, who's the chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, is, I believe, going to be releasing some Assembly priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. And that's important. But I think what most people are really waiting for at this point is, what is Governor Jerry Brown's proposed budget going to look like when he releases it on January 8th, 9th, 10th, somewhere around there, no later than January 10th? That's because the governor is sort of the central role in our process in terms of developing the budget. He's very powerful for a number of reasons. So the first is that the governor proposes the budget. So essentially the governor gets the first bite at the apple, right? So here's an example. Now you don't see these much anymore. This is back in the era when we elected Republicans as governors of California. Governor Pete Wilson's proposed budget for 1995-96. You can see it's the size of a big city telephone book. It still is. You don't really see these as much. They're not printing these a lot these days. I know that print versions exist. Now all of this is available online. This provides spending for the prior fiscal year, the current fiscal year, the governor's proposals for the upcoming fiscal year for all the agencies, departments, boards, commissions, UC, CSU, community colleges, all of it is in here. This is the governor's proposed budget. First bite at the apple. The budget proposal from the governor is also accompanied by what's called the governor's budget summary. Here's one from Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger back in 2006-07, so a little over a decade ago. These also are published, but more likely you'll find it online. This is sort of the narrative, slimmed down version of the budget. It tells you what the governor thinks his major policy priorities are for the upcoming fiscal year, what are the big changes he's looking for, what are the high-level numbers on spending and revenues, what's the economic forecast? Does he think revenues are going to go up or down in the coming year? All of this is contained in this document. I would urge you to look at it and read it, but take it all with a grain of salt, because whose perspective is this? The governor's perspective. He may be right on when he describes a policy in a certain way. In another instance, you may think, that's not quite right. Yeah, you know, that's not quite getting at the meat of the issue here. So it's always something you want to look at, but with taking it with a grain of salt. I don't have an example with me here, but the governor gets to come back in May and release what's called the May revision. This is a state law requirement, so on or before May 14th, the governor releases a revised budget. This is sort of a second bite at the apple in which the governor gets to set the narrative again for the budget. Are revenues up or down compared to what we thought back in January? Did he propose some things in January that just didn't pan out, so they've been pulled from the May revision? Or maybe we need to make some big changes because revenues seem to be sliding downwards, so now there are a bunch of new cuts proposed in the May revision. What's the Proposition 98 school funding guarantee level? It changes, right, over months. When January we thought it was X, now it's Y. It's going to require more money. It's going to require less money. So all of that kind of gets presented in the May revision. And you know what I think I did? I'm sorry. I forgot to show you my slide with my icon here. So the last thing, and the reason I'm thinking about it is because I don't have anything to show you to demonstrate the governor's veto power. That's kind of this red thumbs down little graphic image here. This gives the governor great leverage at the end of the process, right? So essentially, when the governor is presented with the budget bill or bills and the trailer bills, which will generally contain small appropriations, the governor can not only veto individual bills and say no to the whole thing, he can also go into individual line items of appropriation and either reduce or eliminate them. So if the legislature decided to put in $1 million for some worthy purpose, you know, that maybe was going to improve the lives of Californians in some way, and the governor thought it was unnecessary, or we didn't have the financial wherewithal to support it, just go into that line item, draw a line through it with the old blue pencil, and write in a smaller number or write in a 0. So that really gives the governor great leverage during the budget process. It doesn't mean it gets used a lot. In fact, Governor Brown has not done a lot of line item vetoing, but the theory behind that is that because he's working with Democratic majorities in the legislature that have been able to pass budgets by majority vote only, that has given sort of the Democrats in the executive and legislative branches great control over the budget and a great ability to negotiate largely behind closed doors to make sure that everybody is getting what they want, which means the governor doesn't have to come back at the end of the process and start whacking a lot of money from the budget, because in the end, he's already gotten what he wanted through the regular process of negotiations. So what is the legislature doing during this process? The legislature's role is largely to review and revise the proposals put forth by the governor with help from the Legislative Analyst Office, the nonpartisan fiscal and policy advisor. So, you know, here we have Holly Mitchell, who's the chair of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. On the right is Phil Ting, who I mentioned earlier. He chairs the Assembly Budget Committee. And in the middle is Mac Taylor, who for the last decade has been California's legislative analyst, who has a staff of more than 40 analysts who look at all aspects of the state budget, review the governor's proposals, analyze them, comment on them. Their role is to work for the legislature. The LAO does not work for the governor. The LAO answers to the Assembly and the Senate, to both parties. They're nonpartisan, and they give the legislators sort of a nonpartisan fiscal voice of expertise that can lend an ability for them to understand better what the implications of the governor's proposals are. So what the legislature is doing is, starting in late February or early March, budget subcommittees in each house are holding dozens of hearings, March, April, into May, looking at the various issues that they feel need to be raised up, need to be questioned, need to be analyzed, that the governor put forward in January, right? The legislature will produce agendas for each of these hearings. So one of your goals, as I'll talk about later as an advocate, is to get your issue on the agenda if there's any level of controversy to it. If an issue does not appear in the agenda, it's assumed to be approved as budgeted. So if you don't like something, it's probably a good idea to get in there and make sure that it is the subject of a hearing, so that it's the subject of a vote by the Assembly and or the Senate. The legislature does not just, the legislature can do more than just review and revise, right? They can decide, we want to vastly expand affordable child care in California, so we're going to add $500 million to the state budget to do that, even though the governor proposed zero, right? So the legislature has the opportunity to put forth its own policy priorities. It just doesn't mean that they're going to make it through to the final budget, because ultimately they have to negotiate all of this out with the governor. But they do, because they're independent, they do have the opportunity to put forth and advance their own priorities, even if ultimately they sort of get whittled down or don't make it into the final budget at least that year. And then members of the public, as I've been saying, do have opportunities to make their voices heard during the process. You know, some obvious ways. Writing letters. You know, letters are still very important in the legislature, right? We're all emailing and texting each other. It is still very important to put a nicely crafted, short letter stating your position on an issue in the inbox of key legislators, you know, members, chairs of committees, people in the governor's administration, CCing lots of people as necessary, right? You still want to keep doing that because you want your position to be known in a formal way, in a way that's easy to track for people who work in this process. Of course, there is also the opportunity for peaceful rallies, marches. This happens throughout the spring. If you're in Sacramento, you'll know that almost every day of the week there's something going on outside the state capitol in which people are there to advocate on behalf of issues that they feel are important and should be addressed in the state budget process. This picture of all these people standing in line, what are they waiting to do? They're waiting to testify before a legislative subcommittee hearing. If you don't show up, your opinion doesn't matter. The legislature may think, oh, no one cares about this issue. So that's why efforts are made, strenuous efforts to get lots of people lining the hallways in some cases, waiting to get into a room and state their case, even if it's only to say, my name is Scott Graves, I work for the California Budget and Policy Center, and then state the position. That's often all the time you have, but just showing up is actually very important to helping, you know, make sure that your issue is at least is understood, that you consider to be important. The thing I could not put up here, right, is a picture of meetings, right? Very boring thing, right? You're not going to want to see a picture of somebody sitting behind a desk. But probably the most important thing that advocates can do in this process is to build relationships, right? And hopefully doing that at a time when you're not asking for something. So this is, for example, this past fall, even into the winter, is a good time to get in and get to know who the key staffers are on budget committees, the budget subcommittees, you know, what's happening in the governor's administration, who works in the legislative affairs unit on the issue that you care about, who in the departments and agencies address the issues that you care about. That's the time, the opportunity to be getting out there, making them or introducing yourself to them and letting them know who you are, what your concerns are, not necessarily asking for something at that point, but setting up a scenario in which you can come back and ask for something because they already know who you are. You've already made an effort to reach out. Okay. So let's just talk a little bit now about the process. The budget process can really be, as we think about it, divided into 3 periods. There's the July to December period. We're at the tail end of that now. There's the January to mid-May period, and then there's the mid-May to June period. So for each of these, I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about what's going on during these periods and then what the opportunities are for the public to engage. So July to December. Within the governor's administration, this is when everything appears to have gone quiet, right? Everybody's thinking the budget just got done. Nothing else is happening with the budget. Wrong. This is the time at which the governor's administration is already engaged with trying to figure out what the budget for the next fiscal year is going to look like, the budget that will be introduced on January 10th, 6 months later. So they're already thinking about it, right? Departments and agencies are preparing baseline budgets, right? What do they think they need in their budgets just to continue providing the level of services they provide in the current fiscal year? Do they want to go beyond the baseline budget? If so, they're going to prepare budget change proposals, BCPs, right? We want more money for this. We need more money for that. This is the time when advocates should be engaging with the administration. If you don't have the contacts, you make the contacts. Who out in the agencies and departments works on your issues? Who in the governor's legislative affairs unit works on your issues? Who in the budget committees for the Assembly and the Senate cover your issues? This is the ideal time to be working on sort of building those relationships, because if you wait until March or April or May to do that, you're way too late. Everybody is way too busy, way too focused on the thousands of decisions that need to get made and pushed forward. They're not going to have time for you. So this is the ideal time of year to be thinking about this. What is different about this coming year? We have one of those interesting periods when we have a transition between governors. So Governor Brown will be seeing his final budget through the process for 2018-19, right, the upcoming fiscal year. He will be overseeing the process in July, August, September, October, but come November, Californians are going to pick a new governor. And as soon as that happens, the political appointees in the administration, the governors step back. It's no longer their process. The governor-elect and his or her top team members, staffers designated on the budget will be working directly with civil servants in the Department of Finance and perhaps in the department to move forward sort of maybe a plain vanilla budget that reflects somewhat the vision of the incoming governor. At that point, Governor Brown is out of the process, political appointees are out of the process, and what it means is opportunities for engaging become a little trickier, right? So that you want to be engaging in July, August, and September with those in the administration who are still there, all of them, of course, knowing that whatever they're proposing isn't necessarily going to be aligned with what the new governor wants. So it's important to be identifying who on the gubernatorial candidates, who on their teams are in charge with budget issues, who's likely to be the key members dealing with the Department of Finance from the governor-elect team, right? So it's sort of like a little bit of a dance here between dealing not only with the current administration, but the incoming governor-elect team on the budget. So a little bit of a different budget dance going on in 2018 than we've seen for the last few years. In the legislature, this is an important time for you to be engaging, as I've mentioned, with key staffers, with leaders in the legislature. They're setting out their priorities. Assemblymember Ting apparently is releasing assembly priorities later this afternoon, so that's already out. A little too late to influence that, but that would be an opportunity where you go in September or October, you're meeting with them, talking about your issues, trying to see if you can get your issues raised up as part of the Assembly or the Senate's priorities. And then, as I've mentioned several times, this is a great time of year, July through December, to be meeting with staffers on the budget committees in the legislature because they're fairly relaxed at this point. They've had a very hectic 6 months that's now over. They have time to step back and reflect. Much easier to get a meeting with them, much easier to find time to build that relationship rather than trying to do that during the heat of the budget discussions once that starts up again in January. So just quickly turning to January to mid-May, the signature event here is the release of the governor's proposed budget on or before January 10th. Really, for the public here, the opportunity is to weigh in on the governor's proposals. If you like something, say so. If you don't like it, reframe the narrative. Get that narrative out there because the governor has had a great opportunity to hold a press conference, put out his budget and say, these are California's, my concerns, my priorities for the coming year, to frame the issues in the way the governor wants to frame them. If you don't agree with that, this is your chance to immediately push back and try to reframe the issues. Then throughout the spring, the Department of Finance is making adjustments to the governor's budget that he proposed in January and getting ready to release the May revision. If there's something in the governor's budget that you think might be okay but needs some work, set up a meeting with people in the administration. You know, for the most part, they want candid feedback, right? Nobody wants to be out there pushing ideas that make no sense. Maybe initially it's sort of a trial balloon. You can go in as an advocate and say, look, can we work on this? Provide language, provide suggestions. If you just sit back and do nothing, that idea continues to move forward without your input. What's the legislature doing at this time? We've already talked about it. Dozens and dozens of committee hearings. This is not the time to introduce yourself for the first time to the legislature. Hopefully you've already been able to do that in the months before, and now when you come up to the microphone and state your case, maybe you get on the panel actually, so you have more than a me too. Maybe you actually get to sit down and talk for 2 minutes. That's because you built those relationships and you established that trust in the prior year, not the day before. And then in the mid-May to June period, this is when things start to move really fast, become less transparent. The signature event here is the release of the governor's May revision around May 14th. Gets a little tougher here to engage, but you know, you got to take the opportunity or make the opportunity if you have a chance to engage with the administration on a proposal that's come out as part of the May revise. You're going to want to do that. The legislature will hold maybe a week's worth of hearings specifically on the governor's May revision proposals. But again, this is a very compressed timeline, right? We already said the budget needs to be sort of put to bed by June 12th. They're holding hearings in late May. Then we got to move to conference committee because inevitably there are differences between the Assembly's version of the budget and the Senate's version of the budget. They need to come up with a legislative version of the budget, so they're reconciling the differences. That's happening in early June. But early June, wait, we got to have this done by June 12th? So we're talking like maybe 10 to 14 days here in which a lot is having to come together in order to ensure that we have some kind of budget, some kind of budget package that the legislature can move forward with, you know, by June 12th, June 15th, and then passing trailer bills perhaps a little later in the month since trailer bills aren't subject to the June 15th deadline. So I guess I just want to close by, you know, reminding us about some of the key points is that, first of all, the state budget is a statement of our values and priorities as Californians. We urge everyone who engages with the budget process to think about it in that way, not think about it in terms of how much money can I shake out of the budget. It's what is the problem you've identified and what is the solution and why does the solution make sense? Even if it costs money, and yes, most solutions cost money. There's rarely a free solution to a public policy problem, but start with the values and then move to the solution and the cost. Don't do it the other way around. Second, the state constitution establishes the rules of the budget game, right? And those rules are frequently changing. Why? Because we're constantly being asked to vote on them. There will be more opportunities to change the constitution next November on the November 2018 ballot, almost guaranteed. The budget process is cyclical. Try not to think about it as I can start engaging here and I can stop engaging there. You always need to think about it as where are the opportunities during different times of the year, given your issue, to engage with the process, and not just public opportunities, but the behind-the-scenes opportunities, hopefully building on relationships that you've already been creating. The governor does have the lead role in crafting the budget, no doubt about it. Some governors will be more canny, more savvy than other governors. Regardless, though, they're all sort of going to be at that center of the process. So you definitely can't ignore them, and you just sort of need to take that into account. So you're going to need to engage with the governor, but the legislature obviously also has a lot of say in the process. The legislature ultimately passes the bills that appropriate the money that are going to fund the solutions that you're looking for. And finally, all of this presumes that public input has a role, and it does have a role. I'm sure everybody in this room could probably, and online, may be able to tell a story of where they felt like they weren't listened to in some way. Yes, that does happen, but from my own experience, those in the administration, those in the legislature want to know what the public's thinking. Most of them, 99% of them, are there to do good public policy, and you can't snap your fingers and magically create good public policy. It requires dialogue and conversations and input from those on the ground. That is the role of an advocate in this process. So I guess with that, I'll end my formal presentation, and we do have time for some questions, so thank you. Again, for those of you in the room, if you have a question, just put your hand up and a mic will appear before you. If you're online and you have a question, you can use the question pane on GoToWebinar, or you can tweet the question to #policyperspectives. So, anything.
I had a question about the state constitution and the limits it places on the budget, specifically about proposals for state single payer, which I think might be debated over the next several years. There's a kind of a key dispute of whether the revenue that would be raised for the single payer, whether that would trigger like Prop 98 and the GAN limit. And I've seen people on one side say it definitely would be. I see other people say it would not be because it's a special fund. So I was kind of curious your perspective and how disputes like that actually get litigated and kind of settled.
Often disputes like that do get litigated. That's the key word there. We actually wrote a blog post about this. I think last July we talked about some of the constitutional obstacles to trying to enact a single-payer system in California. And just to sum it up briefly, the biggest obstacle is what's called the GAN limit, which was passed as Proposition 4 in 1979. It makes it very difficult to raise the level of revenues that would be required to implement a single-payer system without either violating the GAN limit or going back to the voters and asking for the GAN limit to be amended. So yes, we would argue there's a constitutional obstacle there. It can be fixed by changing the Constitution. And how do you do that? You go back to the voters and ask them to change it. So that's fixable. In terms of Proposition 98, I'd say there's more of a difference of opinion there. And the question would be, hey, if we raise $100 billion to help fund our new single-payer healthcare system, would part of it have to go to schools and community colleges through the Proposition 98 funding guarantee? Or could we cut them out entirely and say, nah, you guys aren't getting anything. All of this money we're raising is going for healthcare. I think that is a debatable question. We sort of presented both sides in our analysis of this, and it does seem like the kind of question where if you didn't have key players on board, for example, the teachers union, just one that comes to mind, you would probably find yourself in court. Anything else? Anybody online with a question? Oh, another one in the room.
Okay, so I'm Randy Hicks, California's Disability Rights. Yesterday was our lobby day for CA for SSI. The governor's, our proposal is going to cost us like $1.2 billion. That's what they say it is. My question to you is, how do we couch this so it looks like it's actually going to bring revenue into the state, even though it's going to cost this much money? But you know, we went to finance yesterday. We talked to the Department of Finance, and they said this is this high price tag here. But isn't there a way that we can say that it's actually going to bring revenue into the state? Is there a possibility of that?
I mean, yes, advocates can make lots of arguments when it comes to expenditures, and I've often heard people say, and there is research in some cases where you say, we invest $1 today, we have saved $10 down the road. The question is, when is down the road? How realistic is it? Who's going to be in office by the time down the road comes? So I think a lot of what happens is it's a little more myopic, where everybody's thinking about the current year and what it means for the current state budget. And I think trying to ask for a $1 billion, you know, as noble as it is and as much as the money is needed for, this is cash assistance for seniors and people with disabilities with very low incomes that the state cut deeply a few years ago, as much as that money is needed for that program, the reality is we're in the final year of Governor Brown's term as governor, and it seems unlikely that the governor would agree to a general fund increase of that magnitude without certainty that there's a way to pay for it going forward. So you can make the argument that, well, down the road we may save money. That would have to be a very solid argument, but it's probably one that's better made at the outset of a new governor's administration who will be responsible for seeing that through for the next few years, as opposed to this governor who's pretty much out the door. Okay. Anything else?
In the state budget process, you know, by the time the legislator approves the budget and the crafting of the trailer budget language, how much influence do we have in the trailer budget language?
So you're talking about that period in June when the budget bill is pretty much done and then the trailer bill language is following?
Exactly.
Yeah, that is a really tough time to be engaging. The process gets pretty dark on that because a lot of that is not necessarily being debated openly in committee hearings, right? It's sort of language that may have appeared from time to time in subcommittee hearings, but some of it may be entirely new. So, you know, that might be a good, we have actually on our next panel some advocates who engage this process pretty directly. So if you might want to, can I punt that question to them, because there may be a better answer than I can provide, which is, I don't know, but I don't think there's a great opportunity, but maybe there is.
I have a couple questions, and you can respond to whichever one works out. So there's this idea from advocates around making an ask, you know, one time, and then coming back again and you know, making that ask, or, you know, making it for a couple of years. And I'm wondering, and you talk about just, I guess, what makes sense and you know, what you've seen. So that's one question. And also you talked about the incoming, you know, governor-elect. If you could provide some clarification on exactly what you meant by engaging with them, because if the budget has to be done, you know, June 15th, you know, what influence do they really have? So if you can just clarify that a little bit more.
Yeah, I probably wasn't clear on that. That's a very important question. So for the first 6 months of 2018, Governor Brown and this legislature, that's where it's at. Those are the people you want to be engaging for the budget for the upcoming fiscal year. Then, after we assume we'll have an on-time budget, after that's done, right, in June and into July and the rest of the year, now we're looking ahead to the budget after the one that they will have just enacted. So that's going to be the 2019-20 state budget that's going to take effect the year after. So that budget and so the new governor, the governor-elect in January of 2019, will be responsible for seeing that budget through. So the weird thing about the year we're coming up on is Governor Brown will be in office with no new governor yet, right, for July, August, September, October. They'll be developing proposals in the administration, but also recognizing that this governor is not going to see this next budget through. The one, right, we're talking budget year +1, as I say. We're beyond the budget we're talking about now. So that's where it's important to engage with the governor-elect's team, and possibly even, you know, we're going to have two people, you know, compete. The top two are going to compete to be governor, right, in November 2018. So figuring out who on their teams are the people who are going to be dealing with the budget as soon as the election occurs and it's determined who's going to be governor, right? So in November and December, the governor-elect and his or her team will then be the ones taking over the budget process and seeing the next budget through. Is that helpful? And then in terms of one-time versus ongoing, I think it's mainly a question of what makes sense for the problem you've identified and the solution you want to see. So if you've identified a problem for which it makes sense to have a one-time shot in the arm of money in the state budget, I think that's relatively popular, you know, with legislators and the governor if they know they're not on the hook for an ongoing general fund commitment. I think so one time would make sense. But if that doesn't make sense for your issue and you really want to see money being committed year after year after year, then I think you just have to go into it and be open and say, this is probably an issue for which we're going to need an ongoing general fund commitment or a new source of revenue. Does that help? Okay. We're actually, we're bumping up against our time limit, so do we, Stephen, maybe time for one more question, or?
Sure. We have a couple of questions that came in from Webcast watchers, so we might have time to get to those both really quickly. The first one concerns the distinction between bills that move through the legislative process and bills that move through, that is, through the policy process, and those that move through the budget process. And so somebody who's watching from Oakland wanted to know, how does it work in terms of whether a trailer bill moves through the budget process or through the policy process?
Okay, that's a very good question, and we're actually going to put out a guide to that, the relationship between the policy bill process and the budget process for coming out sometime in 2018. I think one way to think about it is introducing a policy bill, right? So that's the policy committee appropriations process, can make sense for any issue, right? So if you feel like you want to be developing more support within the legislature, you want an opportunity for opponents to air their concerns so you can sort of fix your proposal, make it better. If you want to build support among advocates, moving through the policy bill process actually makes a lot of sense because it gives you an opportunity to build engagement. Also, sometimes it might make sense to send your bills through the appropriations committee process. As much as people might fear it, if it makes it in there, you're going to get a fiscal score. You're going to have a solid number from budget analysts in the legislature that say how much they think your proposal would cost, which may or may not be helpful to you. Sometimes it might be helpful, sometimes it might not be. So starting in the policy bill process often makes sense if your proposal has a relatively significant cost. What is that? There's no specific number, but this governor has tended to treat any expenditure of $1 million or more as being a proposal that should go through the budget process so it can be negotiated as part of a larger budget package. So if your proposal ultimately is going to cost around $1 million, a lot more than $1 million, in the back of your mind you're thinking, this isn't something that's going to move all the way through the policy bill process through both houses and get the governor's signature as a standalone bill. This is an idea that's ultimately going to have to be shifted into the state budget process and find its way into trailer bill language because the cost is high enough that it needs to be reflected in the state budget for the coming fiscal year. So there are lots of different ways of going about this. Some issues don't need to go through the policy bill process at all. You can just move them solely through budget subcommittees and into trailer bills in that way. But for many advocates in many issues, it often makes sense to sort of start out your idea on the policy bill side of the equation and also consider it as a dual track. Yes, you're starting on the policy bill process, but you're also talking to the budget subcommittee staffers, the members of the budget subcommittees, with the understanding that you're hoping to shift your idea from the policy bill process as it gains steam, you hope, into the budget process. I hope that was clear and helpful.
And one other question that came in from a Webcast viewer, and it goes to the points you were making earlier about how departments start early in the process making their budget change orders, and also they connected the question to the idea of budgets and priorities and choices. And the question was really if an advocate's goal is to kind of make the case that more money should be spend in one particular area and moved away from other areas of the budget. Like if your ask sort of involves not just spending, but actually reducing funding in other departments within the government, how do you make that ask? I mean, is it about sort of meeting with both departments, or how does that sort of effort to make the case that they should be reallocating dollars from one department to another, like what's the best way to approach that sort of ask?
Yeah, I guess I would say you would never want to allow yourself to get painted into that corner. So it's not the advocate's responsibility to explain to somebody on the governor's staff how something would be paid for. I think they would often ask that question. They might try to pin you down on it, but you're not really going to do yourself much good if you start to point at other areas of the budget and say, well, take it from there, take it from there. That is the reality of the budgeting process, right? We hope the pie grows larger every year. Revenues get a little bit larger. There's more money to go around so that we can incrementally expand programs without having to take, from here to move it over here. So that would be sort of the hope as an advocate. The pies, I would just say, well, your own forecast from last year indicated, revenue expansion is economic expansion is likely to continue. Revenues are probably going to go up. We can take some of that increased size of the pie and use it to expand some good programs and services. I probably would avoid going down the road of saying, and if not, you can find the money in higher education, go ahead and whack the University of California's budget, shift the money over to pay for our cause. I can guarantee you that's probably going to be a losing argument, at least among the UC lobbyists in the building. So we've gone a little bit over time, but I thank everyone for being so attentive, and thank you for your interest in this issue. We are always available to provide technical assistance. If at any time during the year you have a question or something you think we can be helpful on, we will try to help. If we don't have the answer, we'll try to point you to someone who does. So think of us as a resource, not just today, but throughout the coming year. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We're just going to do a quick set change here, essentially, and we'll be starting back at 11. For those of you online as well, if you're still listening, we'll be just a few minutes resetting things up, and then we'll get started as soon as we can. Thank you. Pleasure to talk with all of you about what's coming in the state budget or what we think is coming, and you do that with some super smart and very well seasoned, and I don't mean that by age, but by experience, budget experts here in the state of California. So on my left is Moira Kenny with the First Five Association, Mike Harold with Western Center on Law and Poverty, and Anthony Wright with Health Access California. And they're going to help us figure out what we think is coming next with all the caveats that Scott shared, that there's a lot we always don't know. Just a couple of comments to start us off, which is, in terms of what we know already, one of the resources to you all that Scott was mentioning earlier, the Legislative Analyst's Office, has already put out their forecast for what the state's budget will look like in terms of the economy, revenues, potential spending issues and pressures. And that document is available on their website. And if you've seen that document or the press coverage of it, they're predicting a fairly healthy and robust California budget, which the short version of is essentially that somewhere between maybe $7 and $8 billion in additional revenues that are essentially not yet allocated may be on the table for consideration. Now, I say that going into a budget process where the last year of Governor Brown's management of the budget doesn't make me think we're going to see much change in how he usually has gone about this. So I think there's a few safe bets you can make. One is his revenue projections will probably be lower than the Legislative Analyst's Office. That's one of the ways that he kind of sort of controls the negotiation of this a bit. Advocates will put a lot of pressure on about how to use those dollars. The governor will do a press conference when he releases his budget, and we'll most assuredly see two things. One, we've already started the pool on which chart showing a negative direction for the state at some point in the future needs to be considered. That chart's been a popular one. It probably needs its own Twitter account. It'll probably be back. And the safest bet of all is the governor will probably announce that at some point in the future, California will have a recession, and we therefore need to be careful about ongoing expenditures. And that's another way that the deliberations about how to use available revenues will be debated. Now, the other piece of this that's, of course, a huge concern, the kind of elephant in any one of these rooms, is what happens at the federal level. And while we've been sitting here this morning, they've announced a compromise on the House and Senate tax versions of the bills with details to potentially come out later today after House and Senate Republicans have met with President Trump. So we'll know a little bit more about that, but the short version of it in terms of the top lines is that it appears to be even more tilted toward wealthy individuals and corporations than the prior versions had been. So that's not going to be necessarily good news for the state budget. We can talk a little bit more about those details, and in fact, we plan to do that. But let's go ahead and get started. I've asked each of them to come here with the sort of intention of making this more of a conversational session, but with some questions in advance about some things we wanted to address. And the first one is just as we head into 2018 and a new budget process and cycle, what are you hearing and what are you seeing in terms of the environment in the Capitol and what in terms of the conversations about the next state budget? And anybody who wants to start is welcome.
Well, again, happy to start. Again, my name is Anthony Wright. I'm with Health Access California, the Healthcare Consumer Advocacy Coalition. And I'll start by not answering your question, because I think everything that is being discussed at the state level really is impacted by what you just talked about at the federal level, and just just both the specifics of any proposal that does get passed, but also the overall cloud and gloom of what they could do in the future. I don't think it will surprise anybody, certainly the people who work in healthcare and the people outside of healthcare, to know that those of us who work in healthcare have been very focused on the federal government in the last year, that there has been very significant proposals that would do have catastrophic impacts on our healthcare system, on our social safety net, on our state budget overall. And so, I think a looming question is, will they continue that path in the next year? We all know that they tried and attempted to do a major ACA repeal in for the course of the year. We were really happy that they did not succeed. And for the purposes of this conversation, those ACA proposals would have meant a cut to the state Medicaid program of between the 4 or 5 different proposals they looked at, somewhere by the 10th year of somewhere between $25 and $50 billion. And just to give you a sense of scale, even the lower amounts, the one that the House voted on, that all 14 members of our Republican delegation voted on, just to indicate, that would have had an impact in the 10th year of cutting over $24 billion a year, which is more than the state currently budgets for all of corrections and all of higher education combined. So, what was being discussed at the federal level was just so cataclysmic that it would not have contained itself, and Governor Brown said this, would not have contained itself within the healthcare budget. It would have spilled over, because otherwise the choices would be how many millions of people would lose coverage, what programs would be fully eliminated, et cetera. And so I would, to answer your question then, the point is that I think that one of the things that hangs over this, in addition to Governor Brown's normal caution about just the ups and downs of the normal economic cycle, is do they to try another run at some form of, if not ACA repeal, a cut or cap to Medicaid in a major way. There was some concern that they used they used one budget reconciliation attempt to do ACA repeal. That didn't work. They're using the next one to do this tax plan, which is currently being debated. And next year, could they use the next year's budget reconciliation for either something to go another run at Medicaid reform, entitlement reform, something? And that's a big question mark. And so that is something that we have to work through. So I think I'll get to later in the conversation what I think is some of the real opportunities and exciting possibilities, but it does come with this overall cloud of what is coming on at the federal level. And I think that informs a lot of the discussions in the Capitol.
Can I just continue that conversation? Anthony, you're exactly right to say that it's hard to think about what could possibly be happening across the street when we're still really nervous about what's happening in Washington. And for little kids, for early childhood, there's a couple programs too that it's true we seem to have dodged at least the last round of debates around the Affordable Care Act, but two really significant programs for young families and children here in California, both the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, and the Home Visiting Program, McV, are really critical pieces of our infrastructure here in California. While the McV program might not be as large as we would like to see, it's an underpinning of even the conversation in the Capitol around home visiting and expanding services for children and young families. So when we see the potential devastation, we might have a temporary fix on CHIP by the end of the day. By Friday, we're certainly going to be watching very carefully. But we don't have a solution in sight for our home visiting program. I think it's really hard to feel optimistic about anything that will happen in the budget without really a significant amount of work on the part of advocates, not just for early childhood, but folks for young families and social safety net folks working together to ensure that we don't let these two programs go away and that we can build on them in the next year.
Mike? Yeah, I think, I mean, I concur with what both Moira and Anthony have said. I would just add a few additional points to this. One is, this is the last year of Governor Brown as an elected official, likely. And I think that in addition to agreeing that the governor will say that the LAO amount, their budget projections are too high. In fact, I heard finance tell me that yesterday. So I can affirm your suspicion, Chris. But I also think that I can almost guarantee you that this governor is going to walk out of office with a substantial budget surplus, having the state in the black. It's just, he is not, that is part of, I think, his personal legacy that he intended when he first came into office. I know he has other legacy issues that he's also concerned with, but I think this was something that when he first ran 8 years ago, he was firmly committed to, and from day one after he was elected, he has pursued that path relentlessly. And so I do think that this will be another cautious budget year, if for no other reason than the fact that the governor wants to establish a fiscal legacy that shows that he was prudent, smart, and left the state in a better place than he found it. And he's going to do that. I just think that's a reality. I am as concerned as anyone about what's going on in Washington, D.C. I'm actually slightly more concerned about the aftermath of the tax proposal. Yes, I think the tax proposal stinks, and it's heavily weighted to the wealthy, and I think it's foolish policy, and there's really actually no real case that we need this massive infusion of investment or assistance for the poor rich people to push forward employment and investment and jobs. I mean, certainly in our state, we're as good a place as we've been in many years. So I'm not convinced by that, but I really worry, as Anthony does, about what that will do in 2018 and beyond to begin to go after our core programs at the federal level. And that, I think, will then feed right back in to our state budget troubles. So I think it will make members very cautious and apprehensive about major new investments, because they're going to want to, you know, squirrel away money and hold it for a day in the future where maybe the federal government is going to make major cuts. And one issue in particular that we're really worried about at Western Center is this phraseology that you hear virtually every Republican in DC using right now, which is welfare reform, right? So what welfare reform really means in Washington talk is they're really talking about going after the SNAP program, the so-called food stamp program. We call it CalFresh here in California. But the phraseology is very specifically being chosen. I mean, it's no accident that every Republican elected official is using that term, because it's dog whistle for we're going to cut people of color, women, those people. It's a way to allow for deep cuts to poverty programs that if they said, you know, we're gonna starve kids no one would buy that. But that's really what they're proposing. But they can't use that language, so we call it welfare reform. So just be very careful about that. Do not fall into the habit in the next 12 months of using those words in public, like I see so many journalists right now doing. They are soaking up those two words and repeating that over and over again.
So just to provide a little context about the timing here, the federal tax plan that we're talking about, today they'll be having a press conference or essentially they're having this kind of sham of a conference committee, which hasn't really been the folks making the decisions. It's been leadership in both houses. They'll be announcing a deal. They're meeting with President Trump. There's an intention to try to take a vote next week on both floors of the House and the Senate. So that's one train moving that we're all talking about here. The other train is this potential for federal budget cuts that would get proposed most likely right away in January that is not a secret, right? Paul Ryan has been talking about this publicly. Other folks in the GOP have been talking about it publicly. And we know what the cuts look like because they've proposed them in the budget resolutions that they all passed back in the last 6 weeks in order to get to this tax program. So in the sort of sense of the 1-2 here, it's the tax cuts first, cuts to a series of discretionary programs and entitlement programs. That's the big underlying concern, and that's going to eat up a lot of the consternation about the budget in the next couple of months. But all of that depressing news aside, we have our budget process in the state starting up, and I'm assuming all three of you in your organizations have some priorities and key issues that you're hoping to advance. So I'd be interested in hearing more about what those are. Moira, we could start with you. There's certainly been some good news pretty consistently over the last few years in terms of some incremental but significant increases in spending in the early education arena.
Exactly. So thanks for the pitch and the reminder that in fact the last few years we have seen some restoration of the cuts from the Great Recession, and early childhood education in particular has benefited from some restoration of that. The challenge, though, when we look deeper at what's happened, is that the primary focus of the restoration has been for 4- and 5-year-olds. So why should folks, and I look out to the audience, and I don't see a ton of early childhood folks out there, but why should advocates thinking about health and human services more broadly really care about where the restoration in early childhood has come? I would argue it's for 2 reasons. One is because infants and toddlers, those 0 to 3-year-olds, are incredibly vulnerable families within our social safety net broadly. Families are poorest, and poor families are poorest when they're just starting out, when they're just beginning their families. So these are families that we should all really be thinking about. And when the cuts in the Great Recession happened to early care and education, what happened in the infants and toddlers field, the child care field, is that the infrastructure was simply lost. Family child care businesses went out of business. Women-owned businesses closed their doors, and the costs have continued to rise. This dovetails with the rising cost of housing and owning a business, a small business in California in an urban core. And so as a result, women have not been able to reopen their family child care homes. So we haven't seen a restoration. We haven't seen a return to child care for infants and toddlers. This dovetails in with a much broader theme that we're focusing on this year and that we'll be working on with other advocates, which is around the role of prevention. And so I'm thinking about the question that came at the very end of the Q&A in the earlier session about return on investment and how do we understand return on investment? Well, those two things go hand in hand. California has not done a great job in investing in the prevention side. What we say is that the highest return on investment side of the health and human services curve. In part, I would say because propositions like Prop 10 or Prop 63, the Mental Health Services Act, gave the legislature a sense that something was happening on the prevention side, but we haven't worked consistently and collaboratively to ensure that prevention is part of all of our agendas in the health and human services and on the education side. So we're looking at prevention and infants and toddlers in 3 ways this year. One, we want to continue the work, and we really want to applaud the Western Center Law and Poverty for focusing on home visiting and the possibility of a CalWORKs home visiting program, which would also sort of add to our McBee program and begin to create really essential services for families in those most vulnerable years, that first year of a baby's life. We think of infant toddler care and expanding the alternative payment program so that there's more flexibility for low-income families to access childcare. And then on the health side, we haven't seen a real commitment in California to ensuring that prevention services within 0 to 5 space have been a priority as we've rolled out the Affordable Care Act in California, and I would say specifically around developmental screening. So ensuring that early intervention, which can prevent high costs in special ed down the road, we just haven't seen us as a community come together around those 3 prevention areas. So we'll be focusing, and we're excited about the conversations we're already having with legislators and with the Women's Caucus in particular about the real role that prevention can play in setting California up for a really healthy economy down the road.
You know, this year, the legislature took a major step towards addressing the state's affordable housing crisis. Not only was a very large bond placed on the 2018 ballot, there was also a source of funding that was created through Senator Atkins' bill, and there were a whole host of policy measures that were adopted that I think over time will have a really significant impact on pushing forward the production of housing units in California. So we're going to get some subsidized, deeply subsidized units that will be really good for, I think, for folks in the workforce, and I think we're going to be able to see more production of units, which hopefully will help alleviate some of the price pressures that we're experiencing throughout California right now. But having said that, most of what we did this year will not benefit our clients. SSI recipients who are making less than $900 a month are experiencing a rising level of homelessness throughout the state of California. That population in particular still has not gotten back almost any of the money that was cut from the state supplemental payment that's made to SSI recipients. So we took $77 a month from every blind, aged, and disabled person on SSI, and we have still not given that back. It's nearly a $700 to $800 million ongoing funding source for the state general fund. So I get a little uncomfortable when I hear the legislature and the governor tout the surplus because I know where it came from, or at least a good chunk of it, and it's never been given back. And that problem, I think, for SSI recipients and the increasing problems for homelessness simply has to become a priority with this legislature. I think that's really huge. 2 weeks ago, I was at a CalWorks Community College training at Mount San Antonio Community College in lovely Walnut, California. And so I met with about 50 CalWorks recipients, and we do these student trainings where we teach people how to access various services within the program. And so when I was going through our slides on affordable housing and on the housing programs within CalWorks, literally half the adults in the room had a question for me about a current or previous experience of homelessness that they had. So within the CalWorks program, the grant levels are at 42% of the federal poverty level for a family of 3 right now. They're below 50% of the federal poverty level. And we all know from all the research and data that we know what happens to kids when they grow up in deep poverty and experience toxic stress from especially years 0 to 3. We have longitudinal data which shows that there's a lifetime of impacts. Again, these kind of preventive measures that we could easily be taking, and we know what we're doing to these kids, and we don't act. To us, those are going to be our highest priorities. Home visiting fits into that equation because, again, it's targeting and helping the families with young children and with first-time children to help them get those resources that they need. But at the bottom line, the core is we have to increase grants for SSI and CalWorks families. That is the most fair and across-the-board method we can do to reduce poverty in our state.
I want to underline what Michael said about just that we're still working on a restoration agenda. That we are, 2009, 2010 was the depths of the recession when, California taxpayers in their wisdom supported revenues to help fix our budget crisis. But much of our budget crisis was also fixed by fairly steep cuts in health and human services, some of which have yet to be restored now that we're in year 8, year 9 of the recovery. And, in Medi-Cal, there are still benefits that were provided in 2008 that have yet to be restored. We were really glad to have, in the last budget, starting in January, have the restoration of full dental coverage in the Medi-Cal program. In 2020, vision will be restored. I think that's an intentional 2020 vision. But there is podiatry, psychology, a range of other services that are still not part of the adult dental benefit package in Medi-Cal that have yet to be restored. Rates were cut during the time. Billions of dollars was taken out of the Medi-Cal program as a result, and so there still is a restoration agenda for health, human services broadly, and I think we need to continue on that, because at some point, the basis of our social safety net should not be what is affordable at the worst point of the greatest recession since the Great Depression. Like we need to envision a social safety net that works and that we think is better. And most of those cuts were not policy driven; they were driven to meet a budget. And we need to get back to a policy basis for where the levels of benefits and standards should be. But that being said, there has been huge progress, especially in the area of Medi-Cal, largely because of the influx of dollars that happened federally through the Affordable Care Act. And frankly, what is so frustrating about the conversation federally about cutting Medicaid so severely in the House budget resolution, it was being cut by $1.5 trillion, which means tens and tens of billions of dollars in California, is that we actually have a relatively good success story in California. We now have, with Covered California, but especially Medi-Cal, we've actually had the biggest drop in the uninsured rate of all 50 states. We used to have 17, 18, 19% uninsured rate. Now the latest CDC data that came out a couple of weeks ago has us at 6.8%. Like just a dramatic drop, and that maybe suggests how bad we were before, and how aggressively we took advantage of the opportunities to bring that rate down. And Medi-Cal now covers 14 million Californians. That's a third of the state, over half of all children, 2/3 of all nursing home residents. So it is a core program, not just for those who have the Medi-Cal card, but frankly for the healthcare system that we all rely on. It is a fundamental funding pillar of it. And we were glad that we were able to make some progress last year with some influx of dollars from the tobacco tax. We do have a scorecard in back and on our website at www.health-access.org for those of you on the webcast that indicates what was part of our asks last year, what was the progress was made and what progress was not. But I do think that there is we got some, but not all, and there is still more to do. And I would highlight a couple of things. One is the benefits I talked about. Another is a proposal that Western Center and others have been shepherding, which is the point that there are some still holes in our implementation. The ACA says that basically everybody who is here legally under 138% of the federal poverty level has access to Medi-Cal, no-cost Medi-Cal, but there is an age disabled population that doesn't go all the way up to 138, so we need to close that loophole. One of the things that I'm most excited about is the progress we've made on trying to get from that 6.8% uninsured to universal. And the most important step in that is to not have the exclusion of those who are undocumented. And we made progress in that a couple of years ago with covering all children, regardless of immigration status. 200,000 children have that benefit now, and we can now say that in California, every child in every classroom and every playground has access to affordable health care as a result. But there is still more to do. We tried and had both versions of the budget last year had a proposal to take another step toward cover all young adults regardless of immigration status. We would ideally like to see, again, Medi-Cal opened up so that is not a barrier to getting the care that they need, which again improves our healthcare system. Our healthcare system is stronger when everybody is included. We think if we are trying to get to the world of universal coverage, which there's been a new and exciting energy about, There are other steps we can take to increase affordability in covered California in the near term as we work on broader systemic changes in the long term. I'm happy to talk about that further as we go on, but that gives you a sense of both not just restorations, but and aspirational steps forward to the goal of just making sure everybody's in the healthcare system, which then can help with these other areas, because if everybody's in the system, then the funding logic makes sense to do the kind of developmental screening or the kind of social supports that my colleagues are talking about.
Great, thanks. And I feel, you can never fill out these panels with enough people representing all of the important issue areas. And I thought I'd just mention a couple of the other areas where there's certainly going to be efforts to try to make progress. I see John Bowders in the room, our friend from Californians for Safety and Justice. I'm sure that after all of the significant criminal justice reforms that the state has enacted, both legislatively and through approval by the voters, that there will be this continued push towards unraveling some inefficient and ineffective and highly costly systems that we have, whether those are inside of the correction systems or youth justice systems and the changes we've made in recent years. I think you're certainly going to see a push for continued reform efforts going forward, and reform efforts that will save the state and local government's money along the way, which means additional resources can be put back into some of these restoration issues. Certainly the other major category of the state budget that Scott was talking about in his presentation earlier, funding for K-12 education and community colleges, the way those formulas work when the revenues go up, obviously there's significant new dollars that go into those systems. So if the projections from the Legislative Analyst's Office are correct, and regardless of what the governor's numbers are, it will likely be in positive territory still, there will be some additional new funds there. And we're still at this point in those systems where we're talking about trying to get to fully funding the local control funding formula. There are folks on my team who can talk to you about the details of that if you want to hear more. And in the community college world, where certainly there's kind of their own restoration agenda in some of that world in terms of trying to make sure those facilities can serve the needs of the growing population that has demand for those systems. So there's going to be continued efforts toward progress on a lot of fronts policy-wise. One of the things I'm always struck, Anthony, you mentioned kind of aspirational goals and all of this, is it's always hard in the context of budget cycles and legislative cycles for those big leaps forward in public policy, and yet in California we do have a lot of those conversations in and around some of the issue areas you all talked about, universal child care and preschool, or universal health care, or ending deep poverty. I mean, thinking about just some of the conversations that have been happening. So my question for you all is, you all know those processes well, the budget and legislative processes, but we have these intervening factors this year, aside from the federal issue of gubernatorial race, ballot measures coming up next year. How do you think that plays into the types of proposals we're likely going to see, and what it means for, separate from the budget process, but for advances in some of your issue areas?
I'm happy to jump in and say, you said separate from the gubernatorial process, but clearly the gubernatorial process is central to our thinking about this. Over the next year, as we move towards next November, it's been really heartening to note that every single one of the gubernatorial candidates has made a nod towards universal preschool. The work that needs to be done between now and then, and now in any proposal, to make sure that we're ready for that and we understand how that might affect the entire system, and how the system, both the K-12 system and the early childhood education system, will need to adapt and reform and be supported across the age span, so that we're ready for an investment in universal preschool is going to be really challenging for all of us. I think that too many parts of our system are underfunded and really struggling, as I mentioned before, especially with infants and toddlers. But at the same time, the fact that we have gubernatorial candidates really excited about committing to universal preschool and talking about ensuring that all kids have access is a really important moment that we shouldn't let go. So I think it's going to behoove all of us to really step up and be engaged and watch things like the Blue Ribbon Commission play out in the legislature, and other conversations, other proposals that might come out of the legislature as we plan for what we think will happen, with a new governor. So I think there's reasons to be really aspirational, for sure, to use Anthony's word, around early childhood education. It's a complex system, and it's a complicated system. I know you all know that. And to think about how that really affects the other parts of a young child's life. So we're excited that it's on the table.
I mean, I think this is like a tale out of Dickens. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. So, we see all this potential at the federal level, at the state level, while we're struggling with, unimaginable devastation that could be wrought at the federal level. And you hope, figuring out that you always need to make sure that you have the goal in mind, even as you're fighting the battles of the moment, whether they be the rear-end battles like we have for much of this year at the federal level, or the steps forward that get us there. I mean, I think one way that we are trying to encapsulate it is what is our broad goal, and also what is aspirational but achievable without federal approval. So clearly there's been a discussion in our state in the last year about trying to get to universal, even single-payer healthcare, Medicare for all type system, and that we see that as an important goal. It's been a goal of my organization for the 30 years of its existence, but we also see that that's on a different timetable, because that would require ultimately, for certainly implementation, but federal approvals, much less other obstacles to be overcome. And I don't think that we should wait for a new federal administration to make progress, that there are tangible things we can do this year and the last year of Governor Brown, in the first 2 years of a new governor, that can get us so much closer, that can, again, we've shown that we can make significant progress using the resources of the ACA. Can we take that next 1 or 2 steps forward with regard to providing more affordability in covered California, opening up Medi-Cal to all Californians regardless of immigration status, and and there is a way to do that that does not require the federal government as a partner like some broader reforms do. And can we take those steps to get there? And I think that has some interest by both stakeholders and consumer groups and community groups and legislators. But I also want to be clear that it is aspirational. These are not small. Make no small plans here. So it will require. I think there's progress that can be done under Governor Brown, but it will require that sort of leadership of whoever the next governor is, and that's why we want to make sure it's part of the debate of, like, not just what is the goal, but what is the path to get to that goal, and what are the steps to get there. And I think the budget is a really important part of that process, because it is a place where we can show, okay, we're making progress or not, and it's also a place where you can, frankly, it's been very, very rare that we've gotten our budget ask in the first year of asking. Whether it was Health for All Kids, whether it was other things. Some of these, we've been asking to restore dental for 6-7 years. So it does take. This is not a one year, one shot process. This is a multiple year iterative process, but progress is possible. I hope we are trying to convey here.
I agree that we simply have to push forth with the issues that matter to our clients and to the folks that we work with and care about. I recently I was on a similar kind of panel at UC Davis Medical School a few weeks ago, and we had kind of a similar discussion. And I'm actually more optimistic about the future than some, maybe not folks on this panel, but I do think that there tends to be this sort of sense of doom among a lot of advocates because of what's going on in Washington. I tend to view that, though, in a longer-term perspective. I really think that is not a movement at all. I don't think that's really where the country is headed. When you look at the demographics of the country, we are entering a phase where the millennial generation is going to be the largest voting bloc in the history of the country. And they don't believe in what's going on in Washington right now. They don't support that. They are pushing beyond the boundaries of policy. Chris mentioned the kind of stuff that we're seeing that was just unthinkable a few years ago in criminal justice reform. I mean, the progress that has been made by mostly grassroots advocates, formerly incarcerated people leading that fight. It's just mind-boggling. And a lot of that's being driven by a millennial group of organizers who I think are changing our world. And so, you know, what happened in Alabama last night, I hope, is the beginning of a sweep that we're going to see where those kind of progressive values are going to be represented by voters, certainly here in California, I'm pretty sure of that, but I think across the country we're going to see maybe that tide start to switch. So I absolutely think, yes, we have to play defense right now at the federal level. We have to do everything we can to prevent harm from happening, but we absolutely have to keep our eye on the ball down the road. And one thing I would just add, I probably forgot to mention this when Chris asked the first question, but one of the things that I would not be surprised if we see come out of the Capitol this year is that if the tax package goes forward and we see significant cuts from the federal government in 2018, that the state may very well respond. The legislature, the governor, significant special interest groups, powerful players may very well go to the ballot and try to recapture some of that revenue that's being taken right now and given to the wealthy, to the corporations, and have that recaptured and put into the state budget for use for our residents. I'm not saying this because I think I have a crystal ball. I'm saying this because I've had this told to me by people who are thinking about this. And so I actually think that we need to be aggressive and not just take this line down if these kind of things happen. And I think California needs to protect its own folks and send a message that will respond.
Great, thanks, Mike. That actually is a great segue to my next question. But one of the things I want to do real quick is remind all of you to be thinking about questions you might have. We'll go to those next, both here in the room and online. But my next question was, okay, to go back to the doom and gloom version of all of this, you know,
dig in there.
What actual mechanisms do you think the state might have to respond if there's some kind of major hole blown in the state budget by some combination of tax plan and budget cuts? And Mike's just mentioned one, obviously, trying to capture some of the lost revenue that the federal government is giving up by giving away tax cuts to corporations and wealthy households. But there are surely, I'm sure, on the minds of my folks on the panel here, other thoughts about what some of the specific pathways or responses might be.
I mean, so I think, you know, we've had to do a lot of work to sort of respond to the federal government already in the healthcare field. That even without the sort of the full-blown ACA repeal, folks are aware that there's been a number of efforts that President Trump and his administration has done administratively to undermine our healthcare system. And in fact, again, handouts and on our website is a fact sheet that details 6 different ways where the Trump administration has attacked our healthcare system and in how California has responded. You know, they cut the open enrollment period in half. We keep it 3 months. By the way, the open enrollment period ends for coverage to start January 1, starts Friday, December 15th. So if you haven't signed up, please sign up, get your friends and family. Sorry for the PSA, Chris. But they cut the marketing budget by $90 million. Our marketing budget in California is $100 million. I mean, so there's things like that. So we have shown that if the changes at the federal level are limited by their administrative powers or are at a certain scale, California can respond. If there is a limited cut here or a specific cut there, then maybe we can do some things, especially with our regulatory and state powers. However, I do also just want to caution, I know I've said this before, but it bears repeating, if it's to the scale of what we're talking about, that is sort of just such a cataclysm. That's not the money that you can find under the couch even. Even the non-renewal of CHIP is at the level, which is, a fraction of the bigger thing, is a fraction that is like a couple $2 billion a year. That's real money. That's not what you find under the couch cushion. So I do worry about that. I do wonder about, frankly, if we do zero out the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act under this tax bill, what kind of response the legislature would be looking at. in terms of to maintain our markets and prevent 1.7 million Californians from losing coverage, preventing double-digit premium increases. At the same time, how do you do that in a legislature where we, because of some certain resignations, we've lost a 2/3 vote for the time being? So there's those types of issues. I do think that that there is other things that we can do to be brace for some efforts, but if it is the sort of the Graham-Cassidy, cap on Medicaid, or what is simply in the House budget resolution, then that's a dystopian world that is hard to envision. That's UC Berkeley tried to do estimates, and they had to. There just wasn't enough policy levers. In Medi-Cal, you can only cut beneficiaries, rates, or benefits. And in order to respond to that, you'd have to do all three. You'd have to cut coverage for children, IHS, all of IHSS, cut rates, cut whole populations of people, and you still couldn't get to those numbers. And so at some level, it's hard to project that scenario. It's more easier to think about specific issues, how you then fix those.
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? It's going to be all about the scale of the cuts, right? The same holds true with the potential cuts to food assistance and the SNAP program, where simply the scale of the proposed cuts could be hard for state leaders to make that choice between maintaining the eligibility and eating the amount of funds that would cost the state. That just may be beyond the scale of what they can do in an individual year, but there are those conversations. Go to something Mike said, we're all having conversations with folks who are already talking about what the potential pathways are the state would use to respond.
And if I could just say, if any of the 14 members of the California Republican delegation are listening on the webcast, please do not think that the California legislature will save your constituents from the consequences of your congressional vote on the tax bill. That, again, the implications of both the tax bill or some of these other proposals are so great that that you don't think that, oh, don't worry, California's a blue state, will be a safe oasis, and the California legislature will just fill it all in. There are obstacles, whether it's a 2/3 vote for revenues, whether it is other issues, that's not the case. And I know that when we've gone to lobby in Congress, they say, oh, we're a blue state, they'll just make it up. And I think that we need to disabuse those members that their constituents in the Central Valley, in Orange County, will feel these cuts not because there isn't desire, but because there are just real constraints.
Well, so let's go to questions. I'm sure some of you out there came with things you were hoping to hear or questions that you had, so let's see if we can address some of those. And if not, I've got a couple more I can ask.
Mike Harold. A question for any of the panelists, including Chris. Besides the pieces you've mentioned that are largely federal, what other big changes do you see on the horizon relative to the state budget? Are there other past policies kicking in the coming year that we should be aware of? Just prompting us to think a little bit beyond even the issues that you've talked about. Are there other things we should be aware of? That's a broad question. But.
We had our morning year in review with all of the first fives across the state this morning, and obviously a question that's on the horizon, not so much for 2018, but looking ahead will be the allocation of the Prop 64 revenues. So for many of our counties and communities across the state, trying to figure out what to do around local taxation around marijuana, let's be honest, it's a conversation that's happening. And so for us to really remember that this is a moment when, over the next year, to really be clear as advocates that we're thinking together about the power of prevention, the power of youth and young children together, the need to sort of make sure that we think strategically and thoughtfully about investments in young children, K-12 students, youth as we move forward is going to be something we're going to be tracking. That's not going to be, it's going to be another side issue.
I would point to a couple of things beyond what we've already talked about today. One is I do think there's going to be, because it doesn't have as much of a fiscal impact, I think there's going to be a continued focus on criminal justice reform. I think there's much that we can do there. I think bail is going to be a very big issue early in the year this year, trying to reform the state's bail system. And there are there's a long line of proposals that are coming right behind that I think will be a focus of the legislature this year and are things that we can get done, notwithstanding what's happening in Washington. And Chris made mention of cuts to the SNAP program. So our state has, in recent years, and I will praise my colleague Jessica Barthlow from Western Center, she's been the driving force, for California to take advantage of a number of waivers in the SNAP program that allowed our state to provide food benefits to a lot of able-bodied adults without dependents. We call them ABODs in the law. And that was based on federal law and waivers that allowed us in situations where our unemployment rate was higher. And then after the R Act, there was an extension of that law for many counties. We essentially just put it on steroids in California. That waiver is highly likely to go away by next September. 700,000 Californians will lose their SNAP benefits if that waiver is denied and not extended. So that has a gigantic price tag for us, something that we're contemplating right now. Is there a way for us to try to ameliorate the impacts of that? And I would note that to the degree to which many of us are concerned about the visually growing homeless crisis in our state, that is going to exacerbate it, because many of those folks are people who are living on the margins already, barely able to make it, and now they won't even have the small amount of food assistance that the federal government has been providing. So I think that's something that you're going to be hearing a lot about.
Very quickly on, one other federal thing that we didn't mention, we mentioned about the child health insurance program expiring. There's another source of funding for community clinics that is also in the same package of things that need to get renewed. And also there's a continued attack on one specific type of clinics that happen to be called Planned Parenthood that we need to be mindful of in terms of an important part of our safety net. Those politics are there. But on the positive side, I think, which is going to your question, and again, the conversation that I wish we were having was, if we are starting to see, now that we're 3-4 years into the implementation of the Affordable Care Act and the dramatic coverage expansions, the impacts. We're starting to see real impacts with regard to medical debt going down. We're starting to see real impacts in improvements in mental health and in economic security, in other areas, and we're starting to see some areas, and I think that's the area where I think there is implications for a broad range of human services and corrections and other things, is what does it mean when you start to have populations that didn't have access to care now have access to Medi-Cal, including mental health, substance abuse, behavioral health type issues, and what implications does that have for example, policing and corrections and those issues in terms of homelessness. In the last year, several counties, because of our Medicaid waiver, different waiver, several counties have embarked on whole person care pilot projects where they focus on a specific population. In many counties, it's the homeless population, and try to get matching funds for a suite of wraparound services around healthcare to really deal with specific populations and really confront the homeless and treatment issue in some new and exciting ways. And those are the kinds of proposals that we would want to uplift and expand and dramatically. And so, number one, I think that there's opportunities of savings in some of these other areas at the county level that I know some advocates are having those conversations, but also how can we then lift those up to be more broad policies? And I wish we were having that conversation about what's the next step. Once you get everybody in the system, how do you make the system better, rather than sort of going backwards about should we even have a system?
Hi, I'm Jeff and an advocate, and I think back a year ago when we suddenly had Mr. T and we shifted plans to defensive mode, and I'm surprised how California has in a sense responded with a number of initiatives. I think this year, as you point out, that we need to not only defend, but be more, and the grassroots element is developed. What do you see, if you were to think 5 years from now, what is the best thing we can do right now to take advantage of this situation?
So my take on that would be, reflects actually some of the conversation that's happened here, which is to keep driving at some of those aspirational policy conversations, because one of the things that happens if the federal government dismantles some piece of the system that is how we've been operating as a federal and state government delivering services, the question of what California does to fill the hole has kind of wholesale restructuring options available to it, both in terms of how services are delivered and how they are paid for. And having those aspirational conversations for the next few years positions us to be in a place, you know, if we need to respond to federal issues, great, or if there's some other opportunity on the table that California can pursue, we'll have, as Anthony was saying earlier, we'll have not just talked about it aspirationally, we might have identified some of the pathways to get there.
My follow-up on that would just be to quickly say that, and I don't think your question was about infants and toddlers, but I will say that we for a long time in California have presumed and assumed that the fact that there isn't a legislature who doesn't love babies, that was simply enough. And what we've really had to do over the last few years, and we can see that in the progress around both children's health insurance, but around home visiting and around some of the restoration for education programs for little kids, is really understanding that we need to be really thoughtful and really specific about our asks in these areas. And that is something where we've learned a lot from the healthcare folks, from the health and human services folks. You know, on the early childhood side, I think we just assume that because it's true, not to be naive, but infants and toddlers, babies are a bipartisan support, but we haven't turned that into really actionable proposals. So even as if we're in one of those reactionary years or reactionary part of the year, we have to still be really strategic in having conversations with folks about the architecture that we want for kids in California.
I would just add in a slightly, or in a totally different direction, that I think there's a lot of work that we could mine around this intersection that I see between the need, between our state's housing needs, our environmental goals and desires, global warming and ground and air pollution concerns, and the continuing growth of the California economy, and trying to make sure that we have a housing market that actually continues to attract employers to our state the way that it does. And I think there are some warning signs out there right now that we could be at this juncture where we will start to see employers leave because we're not dealing with housing. And I think the degree to which we can concentrate and build more affordable housing near where people work is sort of a master plan that the state needs to think about moving towards. And I see what we're doing now. We have housing over here, we have climate change here, you know, we have economic growth there, and those three things are not being brought together and thought about in, I think, an intersectional way that we must do.
We have a couple of questions, or at least a question from online, and when we've got a couple more here in the room.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We have a few questions that came in via the webcast, and we'll sort of work those into questions here in the room over the next several minutes. The first one was asking about what the impact will be on state and local governments and budgets of if the federal government takes the steps of ending certain waivers that are currently in place. And so the asker was particularly interested in CalFresh or SNAP, but was more broadly curious about other waivers that might be in play.
So there's certainly a major implication for the state budget if there are, if anything like what the prior proposals around SNAP were to come forward and actually be what's part of federal budget cuts in 2018. So what they propose so far is both cutting the funding and requiring that the state pick up a larger share, and some other sorts of policy changes inside that would restrict eligibility and such. So those things all have implications for the state budget in terms of whether it can continue the level of eligibility that we have now and how much that would cost. That certainly has an implication for the state budget, and by virtue of how we do that in the state, it has an impact on county budgets, because county governments are the ones that actually help deliver those services. So that's something that's already sort of clear in terms of its implications for the state and local side of things.
I would just add to that. I think one concern that we have in addition to the ABOT issue that I mentioned earlier is that the LAO will be coming out with a report shortly after the beginning of the year that is going to lay out the state's options for ending cash out in the SSI program. So for those who don't know, recipients of SSI in California, the only state in the country that does not allow those recipients to receive federal SNAP benefits. So we've been looking, the administration and others have been looking at this issue, and potentially we could get the ability to do that, but we would need federal waivers in the SNAP program to reduce the administrative costs for doing that. If those waivers weren't provided by the federal government, it would make the program, the switch, potentially not doable, I guess might be the word. There are other reasons why we may not do cash out related to the state budget. There would be a backfill that would have to happen for some families who would actually lose SNAP benefits under that change, but it is something that we're closely watching.
I mean, on the healthcare side, I would just say, I think the biggest immediate impact is that it sort of curtails some of the ambition that we have. We already withdrew one waiver the day before the inauguration to allow folks, regardless of immigration status, to buy into covered California because of its likely demise in this administration. I think we have now examples of Minnesota and other states that have requested a waiver, and basically what they got back was something that actually, like, okay, you get money for this, but then we'll take it from taking money from another program here, and sort of so that they got basically screwed and so that's not a place that California wants to be in. The current waivers that we have, there's not a lot of, it would be unprecedented to change a waiver midstream that was agreed to, even one that was agreed to by a prior administration. This current administration, the only concern is that this administration doesn't seem to care about past precedent, so we need to be careful. Our current Medicaid waiver does run out in 2020, which would be under this or a Republican administration, and so we would we are concerned about how we would do that, but that's a little bit more planning. But I do think that it is something that we're mindful of, and watching the evolution, especially because the current Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Administration have been trying to talk about things like imposing work requirements in Medicaid and things like that. And she just gave a speech about a month ago where she talked about that the ACA expansion reflected a quote-unquote soft bigotry by not including work requirements, which we found puzzling, to say the least.
So we're going to take a couple more questions here in the room, and then we'll go to one online. I know and I've got a number of folks I've seen who've raised their hands, so there's one here and one here. We'll come over. So we'll make our way around, I promise.
So piggybacking on Anthony Wright's note that successes often take more than 1 year, other than simply time passing, and other than the assumption that you get a broader coalition and you have more people start to care, do any of you see themes for what have been successful campaigns that eventually do say, yes, we need to use more money? Is it whether storytelling evolves, or is there some sort of a theme for what works in asking for money over time?
Since I'm the patron saint of lost causes, I guess the answer to this one. So I actually don't think there is a theme. I think it's really just about seeing the political environment and adjusting and adopting what's going on. I mean, for example, Western Center carried a bill to end the federal bar on SNAP benefits and TANF benefits for people with prior drug felony convictions. I think we carried that bill 15 years in a row, 15 years in a row, and lost. Oh, no, I did win one year. I got a partial waiver with Mark Leno in 2004. So we just for the SNAP piece. So, but then along came this federal court case that said that the state had to shrink the size of its prisons. And so we got this bright idea that, you know, since we're going to have to release all these people, it might be a good idea if they had food and money when they got out. And since we have free federal money we could tap into, wouldn't this be a great idea? So we went to the administration. We didn't get them the first year, but the second year, they bought that idea. They incorporated the proposal into the budget trailer bill, and it passed, and now that policy has been changed forever and repealed. And I would say the same thing with our Maximum Family Grant campaign. We had that campaign forever, and we always made it about the grant levels, right? But the coalition that worked on that completely changed the narrative, right? And really made this about the right of women to make their own decisions and to not have the state penalize women for having children. And that transformed it, made it an issue of the women's caucus, and completely changed the way that we looked at a very noxious policy. And that was an expensive one. It cost us, I think, Scott, what was it, $230 million bucks? Something like that in the budget. So that was a huge policy, but again, that was because we changed the narrative around the way people looked at it.
So I feel like being a representative of an organization that thinks facts still matter, that I think the weight of evidence behind policy matters a lot. It's a theme that it still may take you 15 years. That's not the most optimistic message to share with you, but it may take you 3 or 4 or 5. But I think if you look at the criminal justice reforms, the weight of the evidence around both the really horrible outcomes in terms of whether it was good policy or not, combined with the fact that it was costing an exorbitant amount of money, that makes those set of changes possible. I think if there's, I don't know if this is true in other state legislatures, but you would be hard-pressed to find somebody in our state legislature who has not seen, heard, read some piece of evidence about how investments in 0 to 5, right, are the biggest bang for the buck they can probably make in the state budget. That's well known among the folks, at least the folks who are in power. And that weight of evidence means they're willing to make some year in, year out further investments. It may not always be everything we think is needed. But so I think the backside of it still matters. It doesn't change the politics of having to stick with some of these programs for a long time. We're major fans of the Earned Income Tax Credit, and that was long time in coming, but now we have it. And now they're expanding it, and we're improving on it year in, year out. And so it was worth the long fight.
Yeah, I want to be clear that I think just like time itself doesn't mean you're going to win, right? Like it's what you do at that time, which is you get. Do you figure out a new argument? Do you have new data? Do you find new champions in the legislature? Do you have a broader coalition? You know, just do you wear some people down? But like, but you know, but it does require those pieces, which is, you know, whether it is the narrative and the framing or the data or just the urgency or a window of opportunity. I mean, again, there was a number of changes that have happened over the last couple of years in the context of let's try to get the ACA implementation right? And so then a lot of things came with that were have been on our agenda for a long time, but in the context of getting the ACA right, then made a lot more sense to say, when we're doing the Medicaid expansion, also improve mental health benefits, for example, or things like that.
Now we have a question right here. Hold on just a second. Get to the mic.
Morning. How do we shift? I know we want to get legislation passed. The fiscal impact is always a major component. How do we shift the mindset more to what the social and I would say the impact on the human impact of hopefully getting progressive legislation passed instead of focusing so much on the fiscal. Obviously, the fiscal is very important, but sometimes it seems to be hard to get free health care for everybody. And I think in this day and age, we should be having free health care, at least in California. I think is possible. Health care and progressive social programs.
I'll just jump in quickly and say, I think that, early childhood systems and programs are not cheap. And so we've always had to be mindful about the fact that we're talking about families' lives, children's lives, and providers' lives. And so I am really impressed by the work that our advocates and our partners in early childhood advocacy have done over the last decade and more. You can't leave the human side out of the conversation. And I think legislators are quite thoughtful and in responding. And also, I know that it really matters when we have 100 child care providers show up for a hearing and stand there and talk about the impact on their lives and their business and the kids that they care for. So, I guess, sure, as Chris said, we haven't been as successful as we'd like. We haven't restored all of the cuts even from the recession, and we certainly haven't built the system in California that we want for children and families. But I do feel like California, across the state, on a bipartisan sense, really does understand the experiences of children and families, and we make slow, incremental progress towards ensuring that we're building a system that works for everyone. So I feel like, I don't know, I haven't worked with other legislatures, but I really do like working with the folks in California. I feel like they're constantly hearing both sides of the conversation.
I would just add to that I think one of the keys, and this is one of the keys to this, is finding a champion. So everything we do in California, because of our size, and frankly, almost everything we've talked about here, it costs a lot of money. Anything we want to do in California is going to be pretty expensive. So we're constantly faced with that question that you've raised, like how do we convince people to spend money on this worthy objective? And so, most of the things that we've been able to get accomplished in recent years is because one of the political leaders within the system has made it a priority and has required it as part of a budget deal. And I think, so just from a practical standpoint, that's the thing to really go for, is trying to find that champion who's going to make that big thing happen.
Great, we've got one question come in from online.
Yeah, so this question came from the webcast as well, and I just want to say up front, this is going to sound like a planted question, but completely honest, this came in from a webcast viewer. I'm completely straight with you. So the question concerns the change in administration at the gubernatorial level, and the question is, given that this is Governor Brown's last year in office, do you expect that he might opt to be, far more generous this year in terms of restoring funding for social services, healthcare, childcare, and other things along those lines in his final budget?
So I'm going to start, since I have a microphone in my hand, and to say that I don't expect that the budget deliberations, his initial proposal, will look much different than prior years in terms of, I'm not expecting that there's suddenly pouring of funds into restoring some of these programs back to where they were before the Great Recession. But I do think he has been incredibly savvy and effective at picking 2 or 3 things a year that are big priorities that he wants to advance, and then working with state legislators to figure out how to craft solutions to those. And in a way that I think, if you look back 7 or 8 years, in an individual year, it was really easy to be very critical of what wasn't happening, and certainly we were in that boat as well. But you look at the sort of additive agenda over time, things like, a major housing package last year, a major transportation package, the aggressive expansion of the ACA, and you add that up, what you see is, I think, a very politically effective governor's office, whether you like everything that he does or not, at carefully picking a couple of priorities a year and making some advance, and he's often surprised us with those. And so I do think there will be something like that. I don't know that I would call it sort of, an outpouring of budget generosity, but I think there will be some policy solutions advanced. That will be some piece of his picking some priorities for the next year. Yeah, we've got a question over here.
Hi guys, Jonathan Lightman, Faculty Association, California Community Colleges. I want to commend the panel in discussing the intersectionality between different parts of the budget and trying to broaden the coalition. But my question is beyond that. Do you think it is advantageous for us to impress upon President Pro Tem soon-to-be Atkins and Speaker Rendon to also perhaps modify the process, particularly if we are in a cutting mode relative to Trump, to be more broad-based? And I'll just share with you one example. Back in 2009, when we were having the devastating budget hearings, I remember that Health and Human Services were in the morning, and then Education was in the afternoon. I remember discussing this with Noreen Evans and saying, look, this is the same people. And you're going to expect us to discuss programmatic cuts to the community colleges without any connection to the conversation that occurred in the morning relative to our students and how they're going to be experiencing devastating cuts to housing and healthcare and other forms of social services.
I think that is a good point, which is that there is a intersectionality between the various issues that we don't further explore enough in the budget process. That and part of it is that it's a hard-nosed dollar amount. Like as was said before, I think by Scott earlier, that even if there are some investments in healthcare, in early childhood development, whatever, that do save money in other places, it's not in the budget year, and so it doesn't count, quote unquote, even though we know those exist, and so they don't get talked about as much, and so there's not the opportunity to, although we would welcome the opportunity for education folks to be at the healthcare hearings and for us to be at in the corrections and other areas as well to force that. I think that there is a and I think there was an interesting conversation about what part of the budget process can sort of elucidate that. And I do think that there are some cross-cutting issues, like the impact of the minimum wage, like sort of our social safety net generally, that could lend itself to that type of analysis that maybe we don't get in the current moment. So I think it's a welcome thought, and the question is how to flesh that out.
It's a great point. You think about some of the recent coverage in the state of issues around food assistance and hungry students in the community colleges, homelessness, and folks in in our college system. The intersectionality is something that the folks who are receiving the services or not receiving the services are seeing every day. I think we're fortunate in California that more of that intersectionality conversation happens, but there's certainly room for a lot more of it. Yeah, we have. I think we're going to do one more question at least, and then we'll try to wrap up.
Hi. So my question's about poverty and Prop 13. So California, depending on how you measure it, we're one of the 5 or 7 wealthiest societies ever. Despite that, compared to like the industrialized world, we have one of the highest poverty rates. Our child poverty rate is 3 or 4 times higher than some of the best performing countries. Do you think it's possible with Prop 13 in the law for California to ever go down the path where we make significant cuts to that, where we're, instead of being one of the worst performing industrialized countries, we're actually one of the best performing? Is that possible with Prop 13?
Well, I think, yes, I think that is possible. I mean, you can actually map out a strategy, and in fact, folks in the legislature have, for saying things like, what would it take to eliminate deep poverty, right? 50% of the poverty line, and what would it cost? We're able to put price tags on those things, and we know that there are policy solutions that would get us there. I think the Prop 13 question is a part of the how do you pay for it conversation, like Maura was saying earlier. And it is hard to think about the range of possible public policies that would be very good for a wide swath of low and middle income Californians. It's hard to think about how to fund all of those things if all of the tax system is essentially not on the isn't on the table. And Prop 13 is the property tax is the big problem in that regard. It's why in some respects, it's why we have things like Prop 98 and other sorts of restrictions inside of the state budget. So if we want to have a broader conversation about how things are funded, we have to actually eventually take on the issue of Prop 13, the property tax. There are folks in the state who are trying to do that on both sides, good proposals and what I would argue are bad proposals. But so we do occasionally have these conversations, and the question is, do we get to a point where we make some changes and can put some significant revenues on the table, where there's a lot of inefficiency and a lot of unfairness, to be honest, right? How Prop 13 is structured and what it's done to the state aren't ways you would normally structure a tax system to be good for the economy generally. So there are other reasons to be taking those issues on as well.
I mean, the only thing I'd add is that I think there are benefits that we need to be able to calculate. I mean, I mentioned it's a good thing that Medi-Cal covers a third of our state, but it's also a bad thing that a third of our state needs Medi-Cal. And so if we can find ways to do that, the minimum wage piece, and I think there are other ways to address those issues, then that also helps the Medi-Cal burden question. So I think that we need to figure that out. But the question is revenues, and I do think that the federal tax bill that conference report out late in the next day or two, a vote on Monday, Tuesday, will have an impact on our ability to maybe raise those revenues if it takes away or severely limits state and local tax deductibility as it looks like it's proposed. So we need to we have to be creative about responding to that once we see what the finals of what that is, because that's an essential part of anything we can do. And I think, and let me be clear, when Majority Leader McCarthy defends why is he voting to double tax his own constituents, he's explicit about the fact, this will constrain those legislators at the state level to raise your taxes. So he is making the explicit argument that this will handcuff California's ability to do the things that we want to do in this room. So we should continue, we shouldn't give that issue up yet, at least for another week.
So we're going to take one more question from our online audience, and then we'll close up.
So we said one last question come in via the webcast, and we're kind of up against time, so maybe just to get a quick thought or two on what I recognize as a pretty broad question. But this was actually about environmental leadership in California, and their question has to do with when you look at the drought here and the wildfires, and you look at the complete inaction at the federal level on the environment, and then you have Governor Brown leaving office. What would you reflect on in terms of what the future of environmental leadership looks like in California, given the upcoming change in administration? Big question, obviously. We just have a couple minutes left, but just a thought or two on that question.
I'll just go very quickly. I think I'm proud of what California has done from afar. From a healthcare point of view, I think it has two impacts. One is that, at the end of the day, people's health is more determined by their environment, their social determinants, than about their health insurance, right? Health insurance, don't get me wrong, health insurance is incredibly important because once you do get sick, it prevents you from going bankrupt. It provides financial security, but it doesn't keep you health. Once you're in the healthcare system, you're already sick. And so whether it's our air quality or water quality, whether it's the ability to have walkable communities so that we deal with diabetes and obesity and those things, that's incredibly important. And I think that the environmental work that we've done is there. And I do think that once we have more and more people in the healthcare system, the logic of making more of those investments in the upfront prevention, healthcare, environmental aspects will become clearer because we're fundamentally making a statement that we care for one another, not just literally, but figuratively. That's why I think that there has been the big debate about healthcare, is because it's not just about the program Medicaid, it's about this fundamental question, do we care for one another? And that's the values that we need to have in our healthcare system and the environment, is do we care for everybody, in every community with regard to the air they breathe, the communities they live in, et cetera.
I actually think it's a great closing question, in part because, working with kids 0 to 5 and working on behalf of the youngest Californians, we can't help but think that these are the Californians who are going to suffer the most. And so it's been really extraordinary just over the last month, an extraordinary astonishment at the way in which the counties that were affected by the North Bay fires have come together, not just to respond to the fire, but to think about how one plans for the future. What is the child care system that we need? When when Kaiser couldn't send its doctors and nurses to work in the day after the fire because there was nowhere to send the children for childcare because we'd lost 1,000 childcare spaces. I think that really galvanized for the first time a conversation that I know we have to have in California about the intersection between the needs of really young kids, the needs of all of our workers, and the impending climate change, you know, the on the ground now climate change. So I think that to use the term that was raised previously around intersectionality, I look forward to the conversations that we're going to have in California about the relationships between environmental change and early childhood issues and healthcare and the social safety net. I know that the First Five, speaking for the folks that I work on behalf of across the state, are on the ground trying to figure this out right now. And so I think it's definitely something that we're going to build on and really find strength in, I think.
Great, that's a terrific point to end on. Please join me in thanking Moira, Anthony, and Michael. And thank you to our webcast audience for joining us, and to all of you in the room for taking a large portion of your day and spending it talking about the California state budget. We'll certainly be at our end talking about a lot more in the months to come. Have a great day.